The liar's paradox is a simple sentence that creates a logical problem. It says, this statement is false. If the statement is true, then what it says must be correct. But the statement says it is false, which means it cannot be true. If the statement is false, then what it says is incorrect. But that means the statement must be true. No matter which way you look at it, the sentence contradicts itself. This paradox challenges the way we think about truth and language. At first, it seems like a trick of words, but the problem runs deeper. I'd love to invite you to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's incredible to think about how we're all connected through these stories and ideas. If you enjoy these thought-provoking explorations, consider subscribing to Tired Thinker so we can keep bringing you reflective narratives. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your imagination drift as we delve into the mind-boggling paradoxes and mysteries. Logic relies on statements being either true or false. The liar's paradox does not fit into either category. It exposes a gap in our understanding of logic and forces us to question how we define truth. Imagine a situation where two people are talking. One says, "Everything I say is false." If that statement is true, then everything they say must be false. But if everything they say is false, then their statement must also be false, which means at least some things they say must be true. This creates a contradiction that cannot be resolved. The problem gets worse when you try to build logical systems around truth and falsity. Suppose you have a machine designed to sort statements into true and false categories. If it encounters the liar's paradox, it will not be able to categorize it. The statement breaks the system by not fitting into either group. It does not follow the expected rules of logic. A similar problem appears in everyday life. Imagine a politician who says, "I always lie." If the statement is true, then they must be lying, which makes the statement false. If the statement is false, then they must sometimes tell the truth. But if they sometimes tell the truth, the statement, "I always lie," is incorrect. This kind of self-referential statement leads to a loop that does not resolve. In mathematics and philosophy, self-referential problems cause difficulties. Bertrand Russell discovered a similar problem in set theory. He described a set that contains all sets that do not contain themselves. If this set includes itself, then it should not be in the set. If it does not include itself, then it should be in the set. The contradiction shows that not all logical definitions work as expected. The liar's paradox also appears in programming and artificial intelligence. A computer system designed to process logical statements might struggle with self-referential inputs. If a program is asked to determine whether the statement, "This statement is false," is true or false, it could enter an infinite loop. It cannot resolve the contradiction, so it continues to process the problem without finding an answer. This paradox has real-world consequences in philosophy and linguistics. Language depends on clear definitions of truth. When a statement contradicts itself, it challenges the idea that every sentence must be either true or false. Some philosophers argue that statements like this do not have a truth value. Others believe the paradox suggests a flaw in how we think about logic. Different approaches try to solve the liar's paradox. One way is to say that self-referential statements are meaningless. If the statement does not fit into normal truth conditions, then it does not belong in logical analysis. But this solution is not satisfying. The sentence follows grammatical rules and seems understandable. It does not feel meaningless, even if it creates a contradiction. Another approach is to introduce a third category beyond true and false. Some logical systems allow statements to be undefined or indeterminate. This avoids the contradiction by saying that the liar's paradox does not belong in a true or false framework. But this raises new questions. If some statements are neither true nor false, how many other statements might also fall into this category? The paradox becomes even more complex when expanded. Imagine two people. One says, "The next thing my friend says is true." The other replies, "The first person is lying." The contradiction is now spread across two people, but the problem remains the same. If the first person is telling the truth, then the second person must be correct that they are lying. But if they are lying, then the first person is not telling the truth, which contradicts the assumption. A similar version exists with two statements. The first says the second statement is true. The second says the first statement is false. If the first statement is true, then the second statement must also be true. But the second statement says that the first is false. This again creates a logical loop. Paradoxes like this expose weaknesses in logical systems. They show that rules of truth and falsity do not always apply in the way we expect. Some theories suggest that truth must be grounded in facts about the world. In this view, statements need an external reference to be meaningful. The liar's paradox refers only to itself, which might explain why it causes a contradiction. This problem connects to larger questions about knowledge and certainty. If truth depends on clear definitions, then statements that challenge those definitions raise doubts about logic itself. The liar's paradox is not just a trick of words. It reveals a deeper issue about how we define and understand reality. The Barber Paradox is a logical puzzle that seems straightforward but leads to a contradiction. It asks a simple question. If a barber shaves all and only those men who do not shave themselves, then who shaves the barber? If the barber shaves himself, then he is shaving someone who shaves themselves, which breaks the rule. If he does not shave himself, then according to the rule, he must shave himself. The problem creates a loop with no logical way out. To understand the paradox, imagine a small town with a strict grooming rule. Every man in the town must either shave himself or be shaved by the town barber. No exceptions exist. If a man decides to shave himself, the barber does not shave him. If he does not shave himself, then the barber must shave him. The rule seems clear, but then the question arises, what about the barber? The rule states that he must shave every man who does not shave himself, but it also states that he cannot shave anyone who does shave himself. If he shaves himself, he is breaking the rule. If he does not shave himself, he is also breaking the rule. The contradiction makes it impossible to determine what the barber should do. This paradox is an example of self-referential logic, where a rule applies to itself in a way that creates an endless loop. It was introduced by the philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell to illustrate a deeper problem in logic and set theory. At its core, the paradox shows what happens when a definition creates an impossible situation. The barber's job is defined in a way that makes his own situation unsolvable. One way to think about the paradox is by considering similar examples. Imagine a librarian who only catalogs books that do not catalog themselves. If a book about library catalogs is written, should it be included in the catalog? If it is included, then it contradicts the rule that the librarian follows. If it is not included, then it should be included based on the rule. The same logical loop appears, making it impossible to determine what the librarian should do. Another way to approach the paradox is to question whether such a barber can exist. In the real world, barbers do not follow such rigid rules. They make decisions based on personal choice, not strict logic. If a town created this rule, it would collapse as soon as someone asked about the barber. The problem is not about barbers or shaving, but about how rules are structured. The contradiction comes from defining the barber's role in a way that makes it impossible to resolve. This type of paradox connects to deeper issues in logic and mathematics. Bertrand Russell created the Barber Paradox as a simplified version of his famous paradox in set theory. Russell's paradox asks whether a set that contains all sets that do not contain themselves can include itself. If it does, it contradicts the definition. If it does not, then it should be included. This problem led to significant changes in mathematical logic, forcing logicians to rethink how they define sets and collections. Similar paradoxes appear in philosophy, language, and law. Consider a rule that states all rules must be approved by the committee except this one. If the committee must approve all rules, then this rule needs approval. But if the rule is an exception, then it does not need approval. The contradiction shows that the rule cannot logically exist. In computer science, self-referential loops like the Barber Paradox can cause infinite loops in programming. Imagine writing a computer function that only processes data that does not process itself. If the function tries to process itself, it enters a cycle that never ends. Programmers avoid these loops by setting conditions that prevent infinite recursion. Logical paradoxes like this one help developers understand the limits of self-referential systems. In artificial intelligence, similar problems arise when designing self-learning systems. If an AI is programmed to avoid processing data that it generates, then it must decide whether to process its own conclusions. If it does, it breaks the rule. If it does not, it fails to analyze its own findings. This challenge forces engineers to create systems that balance self-referential logic with practical constraints. The Barber Paradox also appears in social and political discussions. Consider a country that enforces a rule stating, "No citizen may govern themselves, but they must be governed." If every citizen must be ruled by someone else, then who governs the leaders? If the leaders are exempt, then they are not citizens under the rule. If they are included, then they must be ruled by someone else. The contradiction shows that the rule cannot be applied in a logical way. Another example is the paradox of authority. If a government creates an agency to regulate all agencies, then who regulates the regulators? If the agency is exempt from regulation, then it does not follow the rule that applies to all agencies. If it is not exempt, then it must regulate itself, creating a logical contradiction similar to the Barber Paradox. These types of paradoxes show up in everyday life, even if they are not always obvious. Consider a teacher who only assigns work to students who do not assign work to themselves. If a student assigns themselves extra homework, then the teacher does not need to assign them work. If they do not, then the teacher must assign work. If the teacher follows this rule for themselves, they enter the same contradiction as the barber. The problem is not the act of assigning work, but the way the rule is structured. The Barber Paradox highlights the limits of rigid definitions. When a rule creates a situation where no valid action exists, the contradiction forces a reevaluation of the rule itself. In formal logic, paradoxes like this one often require redefining terms to avoid self-referential loops. Some logicians suggest that the barber does not exist, which solves the problem by removing the contradiction. Others argue that the rule itself is flawed and should be adjusted to allow exceptions. In everyday thinking, paradoxes like the barber problem remind people to question assumptions. If a statement leads to a contradiction, then the problem may be in how the statement is framed. Many logical puzzles and real-world dilemmas come from similar issues, where a definition creates an impossible situation. Recognizing these contradictions can help in problem solving, whether in mathematics, law, programming, or daily decision-making. The Barber Paradox is not just a curiosity, but an example of how language and logic interact. When rules apply to themselves, they can create contradictions that seem simple but reveal deep problems. Bertrand Russell used this paradox to explain a much larger issue in set theory, but its implications reach far beyond mathematics. Self-referential statements appear in many fields, and understanding their limits can help in making sense of complex problems. The Pinocchio Paradox is a self-referential problem that creates a logical loop. It occurs when Pinocchio, the wooden puppet whose nose grows when he tells a lie, says, "My nose will grow now." This statement causes a contradiction that makes it impossible to determine what should happen next. To understand the paradox, start by considering how Pinocchio's nose works. It grows only when he lies. If he says something false, his nose gets longer. If he tells the truth, nothing happens. His statement, "My nose will grow now," puts his nose in a state where it cannot follow its usual rule without contradiction. If his nose grows, then his statement was true. But his nose only grows when he lies. This means the statement must have been false. If it was false, then his nose should not have grown, which contradicts what just happened. If his nose does not grow, then his statement was false. But if it was false, then his nose should have grown. The result is a cycle where neither option makes sense. This paradox is similar to the classic liar's paradox, which occurs when someone says, "This statement is false." If the statement is true, then it must be false. If it is false, then it must be true. The Pinocchio paradox follows the same logic but adds a physical consequence, the growing nose. Imagine Pinocchio is sitting with Geppetto, his creator. He looks Geppetto in the eye and declares, "My nose will grow now." Geppetto waits, watching for any sign of growth. If Pinocchio is telling the truth, then his nose should not grow, because it only grows when he lies. But if it does not grow, that means he was lying, which means his nose should have grown. The cycle continues without resolution. This paradox highlights the problems of self-reference. When a rule applies to itself, it can break down. Pinocchio's nose is designed to react based on the truthfulness of his words. But when his words predict what his nose will do, the system collapses. It is like a machine that turns on only when it is off and turns off only when it is on. A similar issue arises in programming. Some computer functions depend on conditions that can trigger endless loops. If a function is written to activate only when it is inactive, the system can freeze because there is no clear state that satisfies the rule. This is why paradoxes like these are important in logic and computing. Another way to look at the problem is to change the phrasing. If Pinocchio had said, "My nose will grow soon," the paradox would not occur. His statement would be about the future, which does not have to be immediately true or false. The paradox happens because the word now forces an immediate contradiction. Self-referential paradoxes appear in everyday life. Imagine a person who says, "I never speak." If that statement is true, then they just spoke, which makes it false. If it is false, then they must sometimes speak, but they just said they never do. The contradiction is built into the sentence itself. The Pinocchio paradox also raises questions about physical reality. In most paradoxes, the problem exists only in logic or language. But in this case, the contradiction would have a visible effect in the real world. Pinocchio's nose would have to both grow and not grow at the same time, which is impossible. This makes it unique among logical paradoxes. If Geppetto had designed Pinocchio differently, the paradox might not exist. For example, if Pinocchio's nose grew only for clear falsehoods like "the sky is green," then the statement "my nose will grow now" might not trigger the rule. But if the rule applies to all lies, then the paradox remains. Philosophers use paradoxes to test logical systems. If a system allows contradictions, it may need adjustments. The Pinocchio paradox shows how rules can break down when applied to themselves. It challenges our understanding of truth, prediction, and cause and effect. The paradox also explores the limits of language. Words describe reality, but sometimes they create loops that cannot exist in the real world. Pinocchio's nose forces a physical reaction to a logical contradiction. This makes the paradox feel more tangible than abstract problems like, "This statement is false." People enjoy paradoxes because they reveal gaps in logic. They challenge assumptions and force deeper thinking. The Pinocchio paradox is a modern take on ancient logical problems. It is simple enough for children to understand, but complex enough to puzzle mathematicians. If Pinocchio existed, the best way to avoid the paradox would be for him never to say anything about his nose growing. But as long as his ability to predict his own lies exists, so does the contradiction. A well-known paradox from ancient Greece, the paradox of the court, presents a legal dilemma that challenges logic and justice. The story involves a teacher, Protagoras, and his student, Euathlus. Protagoras, a skilled lawyer, agrees to teach Euathlus the art of law. The payment arrangement is unusual. Euathlus will pay Protagoras only after he wins his first case in court. This agreement appears fair to both parties at the time. Protagoras invests in his student's education, expecting that Euathlus will practice law and eventually win a case. When that happens, he will pay the agreed-upon fee. After completing his training, Euathlus does not take on any cases. Whether this is intentional or not remains unclear. He may feel unprepared, lack confidence, or simply choose another profession. Regardless of the reason, he never enters a courtroom to argue a case. Protagoras grows impatient. He sees that under the current arrangement, he may never receive payment. To force the issue, he sues Euathlus in court, seeking payment for his teaching services. Protagoras presents a seemingly airtight argument. He argues that no matter how the court rules, he must be paid. If he wins the case, the court will order Euathlus to pay him directly. If he loses, Euathlus will have won his first case. Since the original agreement states that he must pay after winning his first case, he must now pay Protagoras. Either way, Protagoras believes he is entitled to his fee. Euathlus counters with his own reasoning. He argues that no matter how the court rules, he should not have to pay. If he wins the case, the court rules in his favor, meaning he owes nothing. If he loses, then he still has not won a case. Since the agreement requires him to pay only after his first legal victory, he owes nothing. Euathlus presents this as a logical contradiction that prevents Protagoras from claiming his fee. This paradox arises from the structure of their agreement. The contract depends on a condition that now exists in a legal gray area. If the contract is upheld, the student must pay only after winning his first case. But the act of losing the case while being sued over the contract creates a situation where neither side's logic can be disproven. Protagoras' argument depends on court enforcement, while Euathlus' argument depends on the conditions of their private agreement. The dilemma exposes weaknesses in contractual obligations and legal reasoning. The court must determine which argument takes precedence. If it rules for Protagoras, it implies that legal agreements can be overridden based on external court decisions. If it rules for Euathlus, it implies that a party can indefinitely avoid contractual obligations through inaction. The paradox reflects a broader issue in legal systems. What happens when two logical but opposing interpretations of a contract exist? In some cases, legal systems rely on intent rather than strict wording. If the court believes that Euathlus deliberately avoided practicing law to avoid payment, it may rule in favor of Protagoras. If it sees the agreement as absolute, it may side with Euathlus. This paradox also relates to the problem of self-reference in legal disputes. The lawsuit itself changes the conditions of the agreement. Without the lawsuit, Euathlus has no reason to pay. With the lawsuit, his status as a winner or loser affects whether he must pay. The outcome is determined by an event that was not part of the original contract, creating a loop where neither argument can fully resolve the situation. Similar paradoxes appear in modern law. Consider a loan agreement that states a borrower must repay only after securing a job. If the lender sues the borrower before they find employment, should the court enforce repayment? The borrower could argue that repayment depends on an event that has not occurred. The lender could argue that non-payment itself breaches the agreement. Another example is found in legal loopholes. Imagine a law that states an individual must register a business only after earning a profit. If the government tries to penalize someone for operating an unregistered business, they could argue they have not yet made a profit. If authorities insist that operating a business implies future profitability, they contradict the wording of the law. The paradox of the court also challenges philosophical ideas about contracts and obligations. Contracts exist to ensure both parties fulfill agreed-upon terms. But what happens when one party has the power to indefinitely delay fulfillment? Euathlus holds an advantage because he controls whether he ever wins a case. His strategy, whether intentional or not, allows him to postpone payment forever. Protagoras, on the other hand, attempts to force the issue by introducing external enforcement. This raises ethical questions about contract fairness. Should individuals be allowed to manipulate agreements to their advantage, even if they technically follow the rules? Or should courts intervene to enforce the spirit of the contract, even if it means overriding its wording? Legal scholars have debated variations of this paradox for centuries. Some suggest that courts should rule in favor of the intent behind agreements rather than their literal terms. Others argue that individuals should not be punished for following the exact conditions of a contract. In some interpretations, the paradox is unsolvable, as neither side's argument can be disproven without violating the original agreement. The paradox also highlights strategic thinking in legal battles. Euathlus' refusal to take a case is an indirect way of avoiding his obligation. Protagoras' lawsuit forces action, but it also creates a new set of conditions that complicate the original deal. This mirrors real-world legal tactics where parties use technicalities and procedural delays to their advantage. In modern contract law, courts often rely on principles of fairness and reasonableness to avoid paradoxes like this. Judges may look at the broader context rather than the strict wording of an agreement. In some cases, courts might rule that Euathlus owes Protagoras a reasonable fee for his education, regardless of the original agreement's conditions. In others, they might uphold the contract and allow Euathlus to avoid payment indefinitely. Beyond law, the paradox raises questions about logic and decision-making. It demonstrates how rigid rules can sometimes produce contradictory outcomes. When two valid arguments lead to opposing conclusions, it forces reconsideration of the rules themselves. The paradox of the court remains one of the most famous examples of legal contradiction. It continues to challenge thinkers in law, philosophy, and logic, illustrating the complexities that arise when agreements depend on uncertain future events. A crocodile snatches a child and tells the parent it will return the child only if the parent correctly guesses what the crocodile will do. The parent, desperate and thinking cleverly, says, "You won't return the child." Now the crocodile faces a dilemma. If the crocodile planned to return the child, the parent's guess would be wrong. But according to the rule, the child is only returned for a correct guess. Since the guess was incorrect, the crocodile should not return the child. However, that means the parent's prediction was actually right. But if the prediction was right, the crocodile must return the child. This contradiction makes it impossible to follow the original rule without breaking it. This paradox exposes a flaw in self-referential logic. The crocodile's rule sets up a logical trap where any outcome contradicts itself. It becomes impossible to say what should happen because the rule prevents a consistent result. The problem lies in the way the crocodile's rule creates a feedback loop. The return of the child depends on the accuracy of the parent's guess, but the accuracy of the guess changes based on whether the child is returned. A simpler way to see this contradiction is to imagine a different version of the scenario. Suppose a game show host says, "If you guess correctly whether you win a prize, I'll give it to you." If a contestant guesses, "I won't win the prize," the host cannot follow through without creating a contradiction. If the contestant was supposed to lose, the prediction was right, so they should win. If they were supposed to win, the prediction was wrong, so they should lose. The rule collapses under its own conditions. The crocodile paradox works because it mixes logic with unpredictability. Normally, a question about the future has a clear answer. If someone asks, "Will it rain tomorrow?" the answer is either yes or no, and reality confirms it later. But in this case, the future event is tied directly to the prediction itself, making it impossible to resolve without contradiction. This paradox can be linked to other self-referential problems, such as the liar's paradox. The statement, "This sentence is false," creates a similar loop because if it's true, then it must be false, and if it's false, then it must be true. Both paradoxes rely on a system where the truth or falsehood of a statement changes based on how it is interpreted. The crocodile's dilemma also resembles legal loopholes. Imagine a law that says, if a judge predicts that a law will be broken, it must be enforced. But if the law is enforced, the prediction was correct, meaning no crime happened. This kind of situation creates uncertainty about whether the law can ever be applied fairly. It is why legal systems avoid self-referential rules that depend on the outcome of their own enforcement. In philosophy, this paradox is often used to illustrate problems with conditional promises. If a person says, "I will only keep this promise if you correctly guess whether I will," then any attempt to fulfill or break the promise contradicts itself. The issue arises from making the promise depend on something uncertain while also claiming certainty in how it will be decided. This type of contradiction appears in everyday life in more subtle ways. For example, if a manager tells an employee, "You will only be promoted if you correctly predict your own promotion," the employee faces an impossible situation. If they predict they will be promoted, and that was not the original plan, then the rule suggests they should not be promoted. But if they predict they won't be promoted, and that was correct, the rule suggests they should be promoted. No decision can be made without breaking the original condition. The crocodile paradox also appears in logic puzzles and game theory, a game in which a player must guess the other player's move, but the move depends on the guess itself, leads to an infinite loop of decision-making. This occurs in strategic thinking, where one player tries to anticipate an opponent's actions based on how the opponent anticipates their actions. This paradox also highlights the difficulty of dealing with future events that depend on predictions. Insurance companies face a similar issue when trying to set rates for customers who may or may not file claims. If an insurance company sets a policy where only people who correctly guess their own claims receive coverage, it creates a self-referential loop. If a customer predicts they will file a claim and does, the system suggests they shouldn't have been eligible. If they predict they won't file a claim and don't, then the system suggests they should have been covered. This contradiction makes it impossible to use the rule fairly. Psychology also provides examples of similar paradoxes. A person who says, "I will only be happy if I correctly predict my own happiness," creates an impossible condition. If they predict happiness and feel unhappy, the prediction was wrong. If they predict unhappiness but feel happy, the prediction was also wrong. This type of thinking can trap people in cycles of overanalyzing their emotions instead of experiencing them naturally. In artificial intelligence, similar problems arise when designing algorithms that predict outcomes while also influencing them. If a machine learning model is trained to forecast stock prices, but investors base their decisions on that prediction, the market changes based on the prediction itself. If the model predicts a stock will rise, investors may buy it, causing the price to rise, making the prediction correct, but only because the prediction existed. If the model predicts the stock will fall and investors sell, the price drops, again making the prediction true because of the prediction itself. This self-referential loop makes forecasting unstable. This paradox also has implications for free will and determinism. If the future is predetermined, then predicting it should be possible, but if predicting it changes it, then the future is not fixed. The Crocodile Paradox exposes this contradiction by showing that a prediction can only be certain if it does not influence what happens. But in this scenario, the prediction directly determines the outcome, making it impossible to resolve. In decision-making, people often face similar loops. If a coach tells a player, "You will only start the game if you predict correctly whether you will start," the player has no logical way to make a decision. If they predict they will start, but the coach was not planning to start them, the prediction becomes wrong. But if they predict they won't start and that was correct, then the coach should start them, making the prediction wrong again. The paradox also appears in political promises. If a leader says, "I will only implement this policy if the public correctly predicts whether I will," then public expectations directly control the decision. If most people believe the policy will happen, it must happen, making their prediction correct. But if most people believe it won't happen, then it must not, making their prediction correct in that case. This creates an unstable decision process where the outcome is never independent of public belief. The Crocodile Paradox challenges basic logic by making a decision dependent on itself. It forces an impossible choice where any resolution contradicts itself. This type of paradox appears in many areas, from legal systems and game theory to psychology and artificial intelligence. It serves as a reminder that some rules, when designed poorly, lead to contradictions that cannot be resolved within their own framework. The Grandfather Paradox is a well-known thought experiment in time travel. It asks what would happen if a person traveled back in time and prevented their own grandfather from having children. If that happens, then the time traveler's parent is never born, and neither is the traveler. But if the traveler never exists, how did they go back in time in the first place? Imagine a man named Alex who invents a time machine. He decides to go back to the 1940s to meet his grandfather as a young man. For some reason, Alex prevents his grandfather from meeting his future wife. Maybe he convinces him to move to a different country, or perhaps something more direct happens. Without this meeting, Alex's father is never born, which means Alex himself is never born. If Alex never exists, then he never built the time machine and never traveled back. That means nothing stopped his grandfather from meeting his future wife. If his grandfather did meet her, then Alex's father was born, and eventually Alex was born too. That would mean Alex did travel back in time after all. But then he prevented his own birth, so the cycle starts again. The paradox creates an endless logical loop. This contradiction suggests that time travel into the past, at least in this way, might not be possible. The paradox shows a fundamental problem with changing past events. If a time traveler can alter history in a way that prevents their own existence, then the original change could never happen. The timeline cannot support both versions of reality at the same time. Some scientists and philosophers have tried to solve this paradox in different ways. One possible explanation is the idea of multiple timelines. If Alex prevents his grandfather from meeting his future wife, he does not erase himself from existence. Instead, he creates a new timeline where he was never born. His original timeline still exists, but his actions have created a parallel reality where events play out differently. In this case, Alex never disappears. He simply remains in a new version of history where he does not belong. Another idea suggests that time itself might resist changes. Some theories propose that any attempt to alter the past will lead to events correcting themselves in some way. If Alex tries to prevent his grandfather from meeting his future wife, something will always happen to prevent that outcome. Maybe Alex gets stopped before he can interfere, or maybe his actions accidentally bring his grandparents together in a different way. This idea suggests that history is fixed and cannot be changed no matter what a time traveler tries to do. A different perspective is that time travel does not change the past, but rather fulfills it. This is called a closed time loop. Under this view, if Alex goes back in time, his actions were always part of history. Instead of stopping his grandfather from having children, maybe his actions are what led to his grandparents meeting in the first place. In this case, time travel does not create a paradox because it was always part of the timeline. Another possibility is that time travel into the past is simply impossible. Many scientists argue that even if time travel to the future is theoretically possible, traveling to the past would violate basic principles of causality. Cause and effect must follow a logical order. If a person prevents their own birth, there is no cause for them to have traveled back in time to do so. This contradiction suggests that nature might have built-in protections that prevent such events from happening. Some scientists use quantum mechanics to suggest another way to resolve the paradox. The idea is that events at the quantum level can exist in a state of uncertainty until they are observed. If time travel operates under quantum rules, then a time traveler's actions might not have a clear outcome until observed. This could mean that preventing an ancestor from having children does not result in immediate erasure. Instead, the traveler's existence could remain in an unresolved state, neither fully erased nor fully present. A practical way to understand the paradox is to think about a simple time loop. Imagine a person places a note in a time machine, telling their past self not to build the machine. If the past self receives the note and obeys it, then the time machine is never built, meaning the note was never sent. But if the note was never sent, then the past self did build the machine. This kind of paradox shows why altering past events creates logical contradictions. The grandfather paradox also appears in popular culture. Many science fiction stories explore the consequences of changing history. In some stories, changing the past creates a ripple effect that alters the present in unexpected ways. Other stories use the idea of multiple timelines to avoid contradictions. In movies like Back to the Future, time travelers struggle to correct changes they made to the past. In The Terminator, a time traveler goes back to prevent an event, but ends up causing the very thing they were trying to stop. The paradox raises deep questions about free will and determinism. If time travel is possible, does that mean all events are fixed and history cannot be changed? Or does it mean that any action in the past simply creates a new version of reality? Some philosophers argue that the paradox proves that time travel must work in a way that does not allow contradictions. Others believe that the paradox shows why time travel to the past will always remain impossible. The grandfather paradox remains one of the strongest arguments against time travel into the past. It reveals the difficulty of altering historical events without creating contradictions. The paradox forces people to rethink how time, causality, and existence work together. A scientist discovers a book on physics that changes everything. The book contains groundbreaking theories and equations, ideas that push science forward by centuries. Inspired by it, the scientist spends years studying its contents, eventually mastering the knowledge inside. With this knowledge, the scientist goes on to publish a book, writing the exact same equations and theories that were in the book they originally found. Later, this book is sent back in time and becomes the same book the scientist once discovered. The question is, who wrote it in the first place? This is the Bootstrap Paradox, a situation where an object, a piece of information, or even a person is sent back in time and becomes its own origin. The paradox raises a fundamental problem. If something exists only because it was sent back in time, where did it actually come from? There is no clear point of creation. Instead, the object or information exists in an endless loop with no beginning or end. Consider a musician who wakes up with a melody in their head. They write it down and eventually record a song. Years later, a time traveler who admires the musician's work goes back in time and hums the melody to them before they originally thought of it. The musician then writes down the song, believing they created it. But if they only composed the song because they heard it from the time traveler, and the time traveler only knew it because of the musician, then who actually wrote the song? This paradox appears often in science fiction, highlighting the strange nature of time travel. One of the best-known examples involves a person traveling to the past and becoming their own ancestor. Imagine a child who grows up without knowing their parents. As an adult, they invent a time machine and travel back in time, meeting and falling in love with someone in the past. They have a child together, and that child grows up to become the same person who later builds the time machine and travels back. If this person exists only because they traveled back in time to become their own parent, where did they originally come from? The Bootstrap Paradox gets its name from the phrase, pulling oneself up by their bootstraps, an old saying that refers to achieving something impossible. It is a paradox because it creates a loop where cause and effect become blurred. Normally, an event has a cause, and that cause has its own cause, tracing back to an original source. The Bootstrap Paradox removes this original source, making it impossible to determine where something first appeared. This paradox is different from the Grandfather Paradox, which asks what happens if you go back in time and change an event that affects your own existence. In the Bootstrap Paradox, there is no contradiction or change, just an object or information that exists without an origin. One way to understand this paradox is to think about a famous painting. Suppose an artist discovers a painting from the future and uses it as inspiration to create their own work. Later, that painting is sent back in time and becomes the original painting that inspired the artist. If the painting only exists because it was sent back in time, where did the idea come from? It has no true creator. This paradox is often explored in physics and philosophy, raising questions about time and causality. In classical physics, events follow a linear timeline, with each event caused by something before it. The Bootstrap Paradox challenges this idea by allowing something to exist without a clear beginning. Some physicists suggest that in a universe with time loops, information or objects caught in a Bootstrap Paradox may be stable but without a true origin. Quantum mechanics adds another layer to this paradox. Some interpretations suggest that time may not be strictly linear, and information might not always need a clear point of origin. If reality allows for closed time loops, it is possible that some events, objects, or knowledge could exist in an endless cycle. In literature and film, the Bootstrap Paradox appears in many time travel stories. A well-known example is a man who receives a watch from his older self, then later travels back in time to give the same watch to his younger self. The watch never wears out and is passed between versions of the same person endlessly. The question remains, who originally bought the watch? This paradox challenges how we think about time and causality. Normally, cause and effect follow a clear path, but in the Bootstrap Paradox, the effect becomes its own cause. If a piece of knowledge, an object, or even a person exists only because of time travel, it raises the question of whether anything ever truly originates. A man invents a time machine. He has spent his entire life obsessed with a terrible event that happened decades ago, a fire that destroyed a building and killed many people, including his own mother. He has studied every detail, read every report, and memorized every witness statement. He believes that if he can travel back in time, he can stop the fire from ever happening. He steps into the machine, sets the coordinates, and presses the button. When he arrives, the past feels almost unreal. The world is familiar but different, like a faded memory made real again. He moves quickly through the city, heading toward the building that will soon be engulfed in flames. He checks his watch. He has 10 minutes before the fire is supposed to start. He waits in the alley, scanning the crowd, searching for anything that seems suspicious. He expects to see someone drop a cigarette or light a match near something flammable. But nothing happens. 5 minutes left. He starts to panic. Then, in the silence of the moment, he hears a voice behind him. A police officer is watching him, asking what he's doing there. He has no good answer. The officer, suspicious of his nervousness, steps forward. The man backs away, reaching into his coat for something, anything, that will prove he isn't a threat. His foot catches on a loose cobblestone. He stumbles. His arm swings wildly, knocking over a lantern sitting on a wooden crate. The oil spills, the flame spreads, the fire starts. He tries to put it out, but it moves too fast. The dry wood catches instantly. Smoke fills the air. People scream and scatter. He watches in horror as the scene unfolds exactly as he had read about it. He had always assumed the fire was an accident. Now he knows the truth. It wasn't an accident. It was him. He caused the very disaster he had spent his life trying to prevent. This is the Predestination Paradox. It happens when a time traveler goes back to change the past, but through their actions, causes the very event they were trying to prevent. It suggests that history is fixed, that events play out exactly as they always have, and that attempts to change them only reinforce their inevitability. Another example of the paradox involves a young musician who idolizes a legendary songwriter. The songwriter died young, leaving behind only one unfinished song. The lyrics end mid-sentence. No one knows how it was supposed to conclude. The musician, heartbroken by the mystery, travels back in time to meet the songwriter and hear the ending firsthand. When the musician arrives, the songwriter is struggling. The song is unfinished, the lyrics incomplete. The musician, knowing the missing lines by heart, sings them aloud, hoping to inspire the songwriter. The songwriter, amazed, writes them down. The musician watches in awe as history unfolds. But then it hits them. Where did the lyrics truly come from? The songwriter didn't invent them. The musician didn't create them. They exist in an endless loop with no true origin. This paradox raises deep questions about free will. If every attempt to change the past only ensures that events happen as they always did, does anyone have control over their own fate? The musician thought they were discovering something new, but they were only fulfilling what had already happened. The man in the burning building thought he was preventing a tragedy, but he was always part of it. Consider a detective investigating a murder. The case goes unsolved for decades. The detective, obsessed with finding the killer, uses a time machine to go back and catch them in the act. Disguised, they follow the victim, waiting for the moment the killer strikes. But in the confusion of the moment, the detective themselves is mistaken for an attacker. A struggle breaks out. In the chaos, the detective fires a gun. The victim falls. The detective checks for signs of life, but sees none. They run, horrified by what they've done. Years later, sitting in their office, they reopen the old case file. Witness descriptions match their own face. The unsolved murder they had spent a lifetime investigating was their own crime. They had always been the killer. The trip through time didn't change anything. It ensured everything happened as it always had. Some versions of the paradox involve knowledge instead of actions. Imagine a scientist who discovers a groundbreaking formula. They don't know where it originally came from, only that it has existed for as long as people remember. They travel back in time to meet the scientist who first wrote it down, only to find that this person doesn't exist. The scientist, wanting to preserve history, writes the formula down themselves and leaves it behind. When they return to the present, nothing has changed. But the question lingers: who truly invented the formula? It has no original source. It exists because it was always there. These stories show how the paradox locks time travelers into events they cannot change. Every action, no matter how well-intentioned, only reinforces the timeline rather than altering it. The musician thinks they're learning history, but they are writing it. The detective believes they are solving a case, but they are committing the crime. The scientist hopes to meet a great mind, but they become the great mind. A variation of this paradox appears in myths and literature. In Greek mythology, the Oracle of Delphi tells King Oedipus that he will kill his father and marry his mother. Horrified, he flees, hoping to escape his fate. But his actions lead him directly to the events he was trying to avoid. If he had never heard the prophecy, he might have lived a normal life. But because he tried to prevent it, he made it happen. Many time travel stories explore this idea. A person tries to stop an event, but their interference causes it. A leader tries to prevent their downfall, but makes choices that guarantee it. A scientist fears the end of the world, so they create a device to prevent it, only for that device to be the thing that triggers destruction. The loop closes, and the paradox remains. Even without time travel, elements of the paradox appear in everyday life. A person avoids a relationship because they fear heartbreak, but their avoidance is what causes the heartbreak. A driver takes a new route to avoid traffic, but ends up in a worse jam because others made the same choice. A company tries to prevent failure by making drastic changes, but those changes drive customers away. The Predestination Paradox reminds us that some events may be inevitable. The more we struggle against them, the more tightly they seem to hold us. Whether in myth, science fiction, or real life, attempts to change fate often ensure that it unfolds exactly as expected. A man finds an old book in his attic. The pages are yellowed, the spine cracked from years of use. Inside, he sees something astonishing. It's a detailed manuscript of a novel he had planned to write. Every plot twist, every character, every word is exactly as he imagined. Confused but inspired, he copies the book word for word and publishes it as his own. The novel becomes famous, praised for its originality. Years later, after his death, a copy of the book is placed in the same attic where it was originally found. The question is simple but unsettling. Who wrote the book? The manuscript had no original author. The man only copied what he had found, and what he had found was a future copy of his own work. There was never a moment when the book was created, yet it exists. This is the Ontological Paradox, sometimes called a Bootstrap Paradox. It occurs when an object, idea, or piece of information loops through time with no clear point of origin. This paradox is common in time travel stories. Imagine a scientist receives blueprints for a time machine. He builds it, travels to the past, and gives the blueprints to his younger self. That younger version then follows the instructions, repeating the cycle. The time machine exists, but nobody ever invented it. The information simply exists within an endless loop. A similar paradox appears in music. Suppose a musician time travels to the past and plays a song for a young Mozart. The composer memorizes the tune and writes it down, passing it off as his own. Centuries later, the same time traveler learns the song from Mozart's sheet music, thinking it's an original piece from history. When he plays it again in the past, he unknowingly creates the loop. The music has no origin. It exists because it was always there. The ontological paradox isn't just a storytelling device. It raises deep questions about causality and creation. In physics, time loops and closed time-like curves make the paradox possible, at least theoretically. If an event causes itself through time travel, does it still follow the normal rules of cause and effect? The paradox suggests a violation of the principle that every effect must have a cause. In one scenario, a physicist builds a time machine after reading an old textbook. Later, she travels back in time and hands the same book to her younger self, who then studies it and grows up to become the same physicist. The book exists, but it was never written. This creates an unsettling implication. Information can come into existence from nowhere. It was never thought of, never invented, never created. It simply loops through time. This paradox can apply to physical objects as well. Suppose a scientist finds an antique watch left on his desk. He studies it, then travels back in time and leaves the same watch on his desk in the past. The watch has no origin. It exists in a closed loop, moving forward in time only to be taken back and left for itself to be found again. If the watch is never manufactured, how does it exist at all? A famous example appears in the movie Predestination. A character travels back in time, unknowingly becoming his own parent. His existence is self-contained within time, with no original ancestors. This takes the paradox to a biological level, where a person's own birth is the result of a time loop. The paradox also challenges the idea of intellectual property and knowledge. Suppose a scientist time travels and gives Einstein the formula for relativity. Einstein publishes the theory, and later, the time traveler learns it from Einstein's work. He then takes it back in time and gives it to Einstein again. The formula exists, but nobody actually discovered it. This raises the question of whether something can exist without an origin. If ideas or objects appear out of nowhere through time loops, does it violate the laws of physics? Some scientists argue that quantum mechanics might allow for such paradoxes in microscopic systems. Others suggest that time loops are possible but would collapse due to entropy, preventing stable paradoxes from forming. The ontological paradox also applies to historical knowledge. Imagine a time traveler memorizes a lost language, then goes back in time and teaches it to ancient people. Those people write books in the language, which the traveler later learns from. The language has no true beginning. It exists only because it was always there. Another example involves artistic inspiration. If a writer time travels and tells Shakespeare about his own plays, and Shakespeare writes them down, where did the stories come from? If nobody originally thought of them, can they truly be considered creative works? This paradox suggests that originality itself could be an illusion if time travel were possible. The paradox complicates free will. If a person's actions are dictated by a time loop, do they have any real choices? If a musician plays a song from a future source, believing it to be new, is he truly composing it? The paradox suggests that some events might be predetermined, with no clear beginning or end. The ontological paradox doesn't have a clear resolution. It exists because it challenges fundamental ideas about time, causality, and existence. If information or objects can loop through time without origin, it forces us to reconsider how reality works. Whether in fiction or theoretical physics, the paradox remains one of the strangest puzzles of time travel and causality. The Double-Slit Paradox is one of the most puzzling experiments in physics. It reveals something strange about the nature of reality. At its core, this paradox shows that light and matter behave in ways that challenge our understanding of how things should work. The problem becomes clear when you look at how particles behave when they pass through two slits in a barrier. Imagine you have a wall with two narrow openings. Behind the wall is a screen that will record anything that passes through the slits. If you shoot small objects, like marbles, at the wall, you would expect to see two clusters of impacts on the screen, one behind each slit. This makes sense. Each marble either goes through the left slit or the right slit. Now imagine you use waves instead of marbles. If water waves pass through the slits, they spread out and interfere with each other. The peaks and troughs of the waves combine, creating an interference pattern on the screen. This pattern has multiple bright and dark bands, not just two clusters behind the slits. This happens because waves are not like marbles. They can spread out, overlap, and interact with each other. When scientists first did this experiment with light, they found something interesting. Light created an interference pattern, just like waves. This suggested that light is a wave, not a particle. However, when they tried sending individual photons or tiny packets of light through the slits one at a time, they still saw the interference pattern form over time. This was strange. Each photon should behave like a marble and go through one slit or the other. But somehow, even single photons acted like waves and interfered with themselves. The real mystery appeared when scientists placed a detector at the slits to see which slit each photon went through. As soon as they did this, the interference pattern disappeared. Instead of behaving like a wave, the photons acted like marbles. They formed two clusters on the screen, one behind each slit. The mere act of measuring the photons changed their behavior. When unobserved, they spread out like waves. When measured, they behaved like particles. This raised an unsettling question. Does observation itself affect reality? Physicists repeated the experiment with electrons, atoms, and even large molecules. The results were the same. When they did not observe the particles, they produced an interference pattern. When they measured which slit the particles went through, the interference vanished. It seemed as if the particles decided how to behave based on whether they were being watched. One explanation comes from quantum mechanics. In this view, particles exist in a state of probability before they are measured. This means that before a particle is observed, it does not have a definite position. Instead, it exists in a mix of all possible locations. When an observation occurs, the particle chooses one position. This is known as wave function collapse. The paradox is troubling because it suggests that reality does not take a definite form until it is measured. In everyday life, things have a clear state whether or not someone is looking at them. A chair remains a chair whether or not you see it. But at the quantum level, particles behave differently. They seem to exist in many states at once until an observer forces them into a single state. One way to understand this is to imagine flipping a coin. Normally, when a coin lands, it is either heads or tails. But in the quantum world, before you look, the coin is in a mix of both heads and tails at the same time. Only when you check does it settle on one outcome. Some physicists propose that measurement does not just reveal the state of a particle, but actually determines it. This idea has led to many interpretations of quantum mechanics. One of the most famous is the Copenhagen interpretation, which suggests that particles do not have definite properties until they are observed. Another is the many worlds interpretation, which argues that each possible outcome happens in a separate, parallel universe. The implications of this paradox extend beyond physics. It raises questions about the nature of observation, consciousness, and reality itself. Some philosophers and scientists have asked whether human awareness plays a role in shaping the universe. If observation affects reality, then what does that mean for our understanding of existence? The experiment has also influenced technology. Quantum mechanics, which explains the Double-Slit Paradox, is the foundation of modern devices like lasers, semiconductors, and quantum computers. These technologies rely on the strange behavior of particles at tiny scales. Despite its mystery, the Double-Slit Paradox is one of the most well-tested experiments in science. No matter how many times it is repeated, the results remain the same. Particles behave like waves when not observed and like solid objects when measured. This challenges the way we think about cause and effect. In the classical world, things exist independently of observation. In the quantum world, observation seems to play a role in shaping what is real. The paradox remains unsolved, but it continues to inspire scientists to explore the limits of reality. The experiment is simple, yet its implications are profound. It suggests that reality is not as straightforward as it appears, and that the act of observing something can change what it is. A single grain of sand is not a heap. If you add another grain, it is still not a heap. If you keep adding grains, there comes a point when you call it a heap. But where is that point? If you remove one grain from a heap, it remains a heap. If you remove another, it is still a heap. But if you keep doing this, at some point, only one grain remains. That is not a heap. When exactly did the heap stop being a heap? This is the Sorites paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap. It raises a problem with vague definitions. Words like heap, bald, and tall do not have clear boundaries. The paradox appears when we try to apply strict logic to these vague terms. If we cannot say exactly when a heap becomes a heap, or when it stops being one, does the concept even make sense? Imagine a pile of coins instead of sand. A single coin is not a pile. Adding a second coin does not make it a pile. If you keep adding coins, at some point, it seems fair to call it a pile. Now remove coins one by one. Each time, it still looks like a pile, but eventually you are left with one or two coins which are clearly not a pile. Yet there was no obvious moment when it stopped being one. This paradox applies to many real-world situations. Think about baldness. If a person has a full head of hair and loses one strand, they are not bald. Losing another does not make them bald either. If they keep losing hair, at some point, they become bald. But there is no clear point where they made that transition. The same issue appears in aging. When does a person become old? No single birthday makes the difference. Yet, over time, a person who was young is now old. There is no clear dividing line. Laws often face this problem. Consider tax brackets. If a person earns $1 less than a certain threshold, they might pay a lower tax rate. If they earn $1 more, they pay a higher rate. The difference between those two incomes is almost nothing, but the tax consequences can be significant. This shows how small, gradual changes can have major effects over time. The paradox also appears in voting. If one vote does not decide an election, does any single vote matter? If every vote individually seems unimportant, yet elections are decided by votes, where does the importance begin? The same problem applies to protests, consumer boycotts, and collective action. Another example is environmental change. A single plastic bottle in the ocean does not cause pollution. Adding one more does not seem to make a difference. But at some point, there is an environmental crisis. The gradual accumulation of waste creates a major problem, yet no single act of littering appears to be the cause. The Sorites paradox challenges how we think about categories. We like to define things clearly. We want to say when something is a heap, when a person is bald, or when pollution is a crisis. But reality is often gradual. Many things do not have clear boundaries. This creates problems in philosophy, language, and law. One way to approach the paradox is through fuzzy logic. Traditional logic says a statement is either true or false. A person is either bald or not bald. A pile is either a heap or not a heap. But fuzzy logic allows for degrees. Instead of saying someone is bald or not bald, we can say they are 70% bald or 30% bald. Instead of saying a group of coins is a heap or not, we can say it has a certain degree of heapness. This approach reflects how we actually use language. Another approach is to accept that some categories are vague and live with it. We use words like heap and bald because they are useful, not because they have precise definitions. Language works well enough for everyday life, even if it does not always fit perfectly with strict logic. Some argue that the problem is not with language, but with our desire for clear boundaries. In reality, many things do not have sharp edges. Day does not suddenly turn into night. Seasons do not change overnight. A child does not suddenly become an adult on their 18th birthday. These changes are gradual. The Sorites paradox reminds us that many things in life are not black and white, but exist in a spectrum. Consider personal identity. A person changes over time. Their thoughts, beliefs, and experiences evolve. If someone has different memories, habits, and preferences than they did 10 years ago, are they still the same person? There is no single moment when someone stops being their past self, yet they are clearly different now. Weight loss follows the same pattern. Losing 1 pound does not make someone thin. Losing another pound does not either. But after many small losses, a person who was overweight is now thin. There was no exact moment when the change happened. The paradox also appears in wealth. If a billionaire gives away $1, they are still rich. If they keep giving away dollars, at some point they are no longer wealthy. But there is no single dollar that made them poor. Even knowledge follows this pattern. Learning one fact does not make someone an expert. Learning another fact helps but is not enough. But after years of study, a person is an expert. There is no single moment when they became one. The Sorites paradox is everywhere. It appears in language, philosophy, science, and daily life. It shows that many things do not have clear boundaries. It challenges our assumptions about categories and forces us to think differently about gradual change. The Ship of Theseus is an ancient philosophical problem that raises questions about identity and change. Imagine a wooden ship that has been kept in a museum for centuries. Over time, its wooden planks start to rot. The museum staff replaces them, one by one, with identical wooden planks. Eventually, every original plank has been replaced. The question is whether this is still the same ship. If all the original parts are gone, it seems logical to say that the ship is no longer the same. But if the ship is not the same, at what point did it change? Was it when the first plank was replaced, or the last? If replacing one plank does not change its identity, then replacing all of them should not either. But if replacing all of them does change the ship, then at what exact point did it stop being the original? Now consider another twist. Imagine that instead of discarding the old planks, someone gathers them and builds a new ship using all the original pieces. This ship looks exactly like the original before any repairs. If that happens, which ship is the true Ship of Theseus? The one that has been continuously maintained with new parts, or the one reconstructed from the old materials? This paradox applies to more than just ships. The human body is constantly replacing its cells. Every few years, almost every cell in the body has been replaced. Does that mean you are not the same person you were years ago? If identity is tied to physical parts, then you are a completely different person. But most people feel like the same person, despite these changes. This idea also applies to objects like a grandfather's axe. If the handle is replaced once and later the blade is replaced, is it still the same axe? The question remains open because identity is not just about physical components. It also involves continuity. If an object maintains its function, history, and purpose, many people would still consider it the same. Another example is a classic car that has been restored. If an old car is rebuilt piece by piece, replacing every part over time, is it still the same car? Some collectors would argue that as long as it has a continuous history, it remains the same. Others might say that once every part is new, the original car no longer exists. The paradox extends to technology as well. A computer can have its hardware replaced part by part, yet it still operates as the same device. If all components are changed, but the data and operating system remain, is it still the same computer? In digital terms, an exact copy of software functions the same way as the original. Does that mean two identical copies of a program are the same entity? Legal and personal identity also tie into this paradox. A corporation may change employees, locations, and even ownership while keeping the same name and brand. Is it still the same company? A country may rewrite laws, replace leaders, and change borders, yet it is still recognized as the same nation. Theseus's ship forces people to examine what makes something the same over time. Some argue that identity is tied to physical continuity. If all parts are replaced, they believe it is no longer the same. Others argue that identity is about history and function. If the ship has been maintained in the same way and has the same purpose, then it remains the Ship of Theseus. The problem also appears in personal identity. If memories, beliefs, and values change over time, is someone still the same person they were years ago? People often feel a sense of continuity despite these changes. If identity is based on memory and consciousness rather than physical structure, then a person remains the same regardless of biological changes. Philosophers have debated this paradox for centuries. Some suggest that identity is not a fixed thing, but a gradual process. Instead of asking whether something is the same or different, they suggest looking at identity as a spectrum. Others believe that objects do not have absolute identity. Instead, identity is a matter of perspective. Science fiction explores this paradox in stories about teleportation and cloning. If a person is teleported by breaking down their atoms and reconstructing them elsewhere, is the new version still the same person? If a perfect clone is created with the same memories and thoughts, is that clone the same individual? The paradox also applies to art and historical artifacts. If a famous painting is carefully restored over centuries, with every bit of original paint eventually replaced, is it still the same painting? Museums and art collectors face this question when preserving historical objects. They must decide whether to maintain the physical material or the historical and artistic essence. Many everyday situations reflect the same question. A childhood home may be renovated multiple times. If nothing from the original house remains, is it still the same home? A person may feel attached to an old jacket, even if every stitch has been replaced over the years. People form connections to objects based on their history and meaning rather than their physical composition. The Ship of Theseus also raises questions about artificial intelligence. If a robot's parts are upgraded over time, is it still the same machine? If a person's brain were gradually replaced with artificial components, at what point would they cease to be human? These questions show how identity is not always clear-cut. Even language and culture evolve in ways that mirror the paradox. A language changes over centuries, with new words and grammar replacing old ones. Yet people still consider it the same language. A tradition may evolve, but as long as its core purpose remains, it is seen as continuous. This paradox does not have a single answer. Some people believe that an object remains the same if it retains continuity. Others believe that physical parts determine identity. This question continues to challenge philosophy, science, and everyday thinking. A judge tells a prisoner that he will be hanged at noon on a weekday next week. The execution will be a surprise. The prisoner will not know the day until the hangman arrives. The prisoner thinks about this carefully and realizes something. If he is not hanged by Thursday, then Friday must be the day. But if Friday is the day, it won't be a surprise because it will be the only day left. Since the judge said it must be a surprise, Friday is impossible. Now he looks at Thursday. If he gets to Wednesday without being hanged, then Thursday is the only option left. That means Thursday also can't be the day because it won't be a surprise either. He applies this same reasoning to Wednesday, then Tuesday, and finally Monday. By this logic, he concludes that the hanging cannot happen at all. The judge must be mistaken. He feels relieved and sleeps peacefully in his cell. On Wednesday, the guards enter his cell at noon. The hangman is with them. The prisoner is shocked. He did not expect this. The execution happens as planned. The judge's statement was correct. The prisoner was wrong. But where did his reasoning fail? The paradox arises from how he interprets the judge's words. He assumes that if he can logically eliminate a day, then the hanging cannot happen. But his logic creates a trap. It only works if he knows when the hanging will occur before it happens. The surprise is what breaks his reasoning. Imagine another example. A teacher tells a class there will be a pop quiz next week. The students try to predict the day using the prisoner's logic. If Friday comes and there hasn't been a quiz yet, then Friday is the only option. But if that's the only option, then the quiz won't be a surprise. That means Friday is impossible. They apply this reasoning to Thursday, then Wednesday, then Tuesday, and finally Monday. By this logic, the quiz should not happen at all. But then the teacher gives a quiz on Wednesday, and the class is caught off guard. The logic failed. The paradox plays with expectations. The prisoner assumes that knowing something in advance must prevent it from happening. But surprise does not work that way. The prisoner makes his prediction under the assumption that the judge's words mean he can logically deduce the day of the execution. But this assumption collapses when the event actually occurs. The problem also lies in the way he eliminates days. When he reaches Friday in his reasoning, he assumes that he will have already lived through Monday to Thursday. When he reaches Thursday, he assumes he will have already lived through Monday to Wednesday. But this process assumes future knowledge that he does not have yet. Each day, he only knows what has already happened. He does not know what will happen next. This paradox highlights the difference between theoretical reasoning and reality. The prisoner builds a logical structure based on an assumption that future events must be predictable. But events do not always follow patterns that logic can fully capture. Real life includes uncertainty. The prisoner does not know what will happen tomorrow. He only assumes that tomorrow must fit into his logical pattern. This paradox is also about self-defeating logic. By proving that he cannot be hanged, the prisoner convinces himself to stop expecting it. This makes the hanging a surprise when it actually happens. His reasoning removes his ability to anticipate the event. If he had simply accepted that he could not know the day, he might not have been so shocked when it happened. This kind of paradox appears in other areas of thought. It shows up in economics, game theory, and even psychology. In financial markets, traders try to predict stock movements based on available information. But if everyone acts on the same prediction, the market changes in response, making the original prediction useless. The very act of trying to anticipate the future changes the future itself. In philosophy, this paradox connects to epistemology, the study of knowledge. It asks how we can be sure of what we know. The prisoner believes he has logically ruled out every possible outcome, but his knowledge turns out to be incomplete. He learns something new when the execution happens. His surprise is proof that his knowledge was wrong. This paradox also raises questions about free will and determinism. The prisoner assumes that events must follow a predictable path. He believes he can deduce every outcome before it happens, but his own expectation shapes his experience. By believing that the hanging cannot happen, he ensures that it will be unexpected when it does. This paradox has fascinated logicians for decades. It is a case where reasoning appears sound but leads to the wrong conclusion. It reminds us that logic has limits. Even when we think we have eliminated every possibility, reality may still surprise us. The Omnipotence Paradox questions the nature of unlimited power. It asks whether an all-powerful being can create a stone so heavy that it cannot lift it. This problem appears simple, but it leads to a contradiction. If the being can create such a stone, then there is something it cannot do, lift the stone. If the being cannot create the stone, then there is also something it cannot do, create the stone. Either way, there is a limit to its power. This paradox presents a challenge to the idea of absolute omnipotence. If an all-powerful being has no limits, then it should be able to do anything. But this question forces a logical contradiction. The concept of omnipotence implies that the being should be able to both create and lift the stone. But once the stone is created and made too heavy to lift, the being loses the ability to lift it. This means the being is not truly omnipotent. If the being refuses to create the stone to avoid the problem, then there is still something it cannot do. In either case, omnipotence seems impossible. A simpler way to understand the paradox is to replace the stone with another impossible task. Can an all-powerful being create a square circle? Can it make a married bachelor? Can it make 2 + 2 = 5? If omnipotence means being able to do anything, then it should be able to do these things. But these are contradictions. A square by definition cannot be a circle. A bachelor by definition cannot be married. These are not just difficult tasks, they are logically impossible. The paradox applies to any definition of omnipotence that allows for unlimited power. If a being is truly all-powerful, then no restrictions should exist. It should be able to do anything, even things that contradict themselves. But the paradox shows that this definition leads to a dead end. If omnipotence allows for logical contradictions, then the very concept of omnipotence loses meaning. If an all-powerful being can make contradictions true, then words like stone and lift stop having fixed definitions. At that point, omnipotence becomes meaningless because it allows anything and everything at the same time. One way to escape this paradox is to change the definition of omnipotence. Instead of saying an all-powerful being can do anything, some define omnipotence as the ability to do anything that is logically possible. This means the being can create stars, destroy planets, and bend the laws of nature, but it cannot do things that contradict logic itself. This definition avoids the paradox because creating an unliftable stone while remaining all-powerful is a logical contradiction. But this solution comes with a cost. It means omnipotence has limits. If an all-powerful being cannot do the logically impossible, then it is not truly unlimited. The paradox shows that the idea of absolute power needs careful definition to avoid contradictions. Another approach is to argue that the paradox does not apply to an all-powerful being. Some argue that omnipotence is beyond human logic. Just because the question creates a contradiction for us does not mean it creates a contradiction for an all-powerful being. If the being is truly beyond human understanding, then the paradox may not be a real problem. This response avoids the contradiction, but at the cost of making omnipotence something unknowable. If logic does not apply, then it is impossible to discuss or define omnipotence at all. The paradox also raises questions about free will and control. If an all-powerful being exists, does it have the power to limit itself? Can it create a rule it cannot break? If it can limit itself, then it is no longer all-powerful. If it cannot, then it is not truly free to do anything. The problem applies to other ideas about power as well. If a ruler has absolute authority, can they create a law that they themselves must obey? If they can, then they are no longer above the law. If they cannot, then their authority is not truly absolute. The same paradox appears in discussions about artificial intelligence. If a superintelligent AI can improve itself endlessly, can it create a problem that it cannot solve? If it can, then it is not all-powerful. If it cannot, then there is something it is unable to do. This problem applies to any system or being that claims to have unlimited control. The paradox is not just about gods or supernatural beings. It applies to any idea of absolute power, whether in philosophy, politics, or technology. This paradox has been debated for centuries. Philosophers from different traditions have tried to resolve it in different ways. Some argue that omnipotence must be self-consistent. Others argue that true power includes the ability to break logic. Some reject the idea of omnipotence altogether, saying that no being can be truly unlimited. The paradox forces a choice between redefining omnipotence, accepting contradictions, or rejecting the idea entirely. In religious discussions, the paradox raises theological questions. If an all-powerful being exists, does it make sense to describe that being in human terms? Some argue that the paradox is meaningless because human language cannot fully capture divine power. Others say that divine power must follow logical rules. These debates show how the paradox challenges traditional ideas about the nature of a supreme being. Even outside of religion, the paradox appears in discussions about authority and control. A government that claims total power may still face problems it cannot solve. A leader who claims to be able to do anything may still be unable to change certain realities. The paradox highlights the limits of absolute power, even in human systems. One interesting variation of the paradox asks whether an all-powerful being can destroy itself. If it can, then it is no longer all-powerful. If it cannot, then it is not all-powerful either. This version raises deep questions about the nature of existence. If something is truly all-powerful, should it not have control over its own existence? But if it does, then it faces the same contradiction as the original stone paradox. Another way to reframe the paradox is to ask whether an all-powerful being can make itself no longer all-powerful. If it can, then it is not truly all-powerful, since it loses that ability. If it cannot, then there is something it cannot do. This question applies to any idea of absolute ability. If someone has total freedom, can they choose to no longer be free? If they can, then their freedom was not absolute. If they cannot, then their freedom is not truly free. The paradox also appears in debates about artificial constraints. If an artist has unlimited creativity, can they create a rule that limits their own creativity? If they can, then they are no longer completely free. If they cannot, then their creativity has limits. This version of the paradox applies to any situation where total control is claimed. Logical paradoxes like this one show the difficulty of defining absolute concepts. Whether discussing omnipotence, authority, or intelligence, contradictions arise when we assume unlimited ability. The paradox forces a reconsideration of what power means and whether true omnipotence can exist without contradiction. If you dig a hole, you remove dirt from the ground. The dirt doesn't disappear. It has to go somewhere. You might pile it next to the hole, scatter it, or haul it away. But if you think about it, something strange happens. The hole exists only because the dirt isn't there anymore. The space where the dirt used to be is now empty, but the dirt itself still exists somewhere else. The paradox comes from thinking about what a hole really is. A hole isn't a physical object, it's an absence. When you dig, you create emptiness where there was once solid ground. But can you really call emptiness a thing? If you remove all the dirt, have you added something new, or have you only taken something away? It feels like a hole is something real, but it only exists because of the missing dirt. The dirt is still part of the physical world, but the hole is more like an idea. Imagine digging a small hole in your backyard. You take a shovel and remove a pile of soil. That soil sits next to the hole, but the hole itself is just an empty space. Now, imagine filling the hole back up. You return the same dirt, and suddenly the hole disappears. The dirt remains, but the hole is gone. Did the hole ever exist in a physical sense? Or was it just the temporary absence of Earth? This paradox plays with how we think about objects in space. We name things that aren't really things: shadows, gaps, silence. These are not physical objects, but we talk about them as if they are. A hole falls into this same category. If you move an object from one place to another, the object still exists. If you move dirt from one place to another, the dirt still exists, but the hole isn't an object. It's only a result of removing something. Think of a donut. The donut has a hole in the middle, but the hole isn't made of anything. If you bake a donut, you don't add the hole. It appears when you shape the dough in a certain way. If you change the shape and close the hole, it disappears. The dough is still there, but the hole no longer exists. Now consider a tunnel. You dig through a mountain and remove rock, creating an empty space that people can travel through. The tunnel is useful. It has a name and a purpose. But is the tunnel something in itself, or is it just an absence of rock? If you fill the tunnel, it no longer exists. The mountain is solid again. The same applies to a drinking straw. The straw has a hole running through it, but that hole is just the space where air and liquid can move. If you seal both ends, the straw still exists, but the hole loses its function. If you flatten the straw completely, the hole disappears. The physical straw remains, but the hole is gone. The paradox deepens when you think about measuring a hole. If a hole is nothing but empty space, how can you measure it? You can measure its depth, width, and volume. But what exactly are you measuring? You aren't measuring the hole itself. You are measuring the shape of the missing dirt. The dirt had volume before it was removed, and the hole simply takes up that space. But a hole itself has no substance. Imagine you dig a hole and then decide to dig another hole right next to it. You remove more dirt, and now you have two holes. But if you remove the dirt between them, do you have two holes or one larger hole? Holes don't have clear boundaries the way physical objects do. They change based on how you define them. Now, think about a cup. A cup is useful because of the space inside it. Without that space, it would just be a solid block of material. But the space isn't an object, it's an absence. The cup's usefulness comes from what isn't there. A hole works the same way. It is useful for what it allows, not for what it is. You can apply this idea to language. If you write a sentence and remove a word, you create a gap in the text. That gap isn't something new, it's the absence of something that used to be there. The missing word affects the meaning, but it doesn't have a physical presence. A hole is the same. It changes the landscape, but it isn't made of anything itself. Now picture a piece of Swiss cheese. It has holes scattered throughout. The cheese is solid, but the holes are just spaces where cheese isn't. If you melt the cheese, the holes disappear. The cheese changes form, but the holes were never a separate thing to begin with. They were just gaps in the material. If you go to the beach and dig a hole in the sand, the same logic applies. You remove sand, and that sand now sits in a pile. The hole exists as long as the sand is missing. But if the wind blows or the tide comes in, the hole fills up again. The sand moves back, and the hole vanishes. It didn't move anywhere. It simply stopped existing. The paradox also applies to ideas of ownership. If you dig a hole, do you own the hole? You didn't create the dirt, but you removed it. You can sell the dirt you took out, but can you sell the hole itself? What are you selling? You aren't selling something physical. You are selling the absence of something. If someone buys the hole but then fills it, do they still own it? You can see the same idea in construction. If a company digs a foundation for a building, they have created a hole. That hole is necessary for the structure that will be built. But once the building is there, the hole is gone. The foundation exists in its place. The hole was only a temporary absence, not an object of its own. If you dig deep enough, the hole becomes something else. A shallow hole is just a dent in the ground. A deep hole is a well. A well provides water because the hole reaches an underground source. The hole itself doesn't do anything, but its presence makes something else possible. In space, this idea takes on another level. A black hole isn't a hole in the way we think of them. It is an area of space where gravity is so strong that nothing can escape. But calling it a hole is misleading. A black hole isn't an empty space. It is a region filled with immense gravitational pull. We give it the name hole because it behaves like one, swallowing everything that comes too close. The concept of a hole challenges how we think about objects in space. It exists only because something else is missing. The dirt goes somewhere, but the hole does not. It has no substance. It is a gap, a void, an absence. It can be measured and described, but it cannot be moved or held. It is nothing, and yet we treat it as something. The Banach-Tarski Paradox is a mathematical result that seems impossible at first glance. It states that a solid sphere can be split into a finite number of pieces, and by rearranging those pieces without stretching or changing their shape, you can form two identical spheres, each the same size as the original. This idea contradicts everything we intuitively understand about volume and matter. It suggests that from one sphere, you can get two, effectively doubling the amount of material without adding anything. To understand why this is so strange, think of cutting an apple in half. If you put the two halves back together, you get the same apple. If you split it into 4 pieces, you still have the same total amount of apple. You cannot take those 4 pieces and somehow form 2 whole apples. The amount of fruit does not change no matter how you slice it. The Banach-Tarski Paradox, however, says that with the right kind of cuts and rearrangements, you could turn 1 apple into 2. This is not possible with real objects, but in the world of abstract mathematics, it works. The key to this paradox lies in the way the pieces are divided. In normal life, every object is made of particles. If you cut a block of wood, you get 2 smaller blocks, each with a portion of the original material. The total amount stays the same. But in mathematics, objects can be broken into infinitely complex, non-measurable sets. These sets do not behave the way normal shapes do. The pieces used in the Banach-Tarski Paradox are not regular chunks of a sphere. They are infinitely intricate, scattered in such a way that they do not have a clear size. Because of this strange property, they can be moved around in a way that creates two spheres from one. The paradox relies on the axiom of choice, a principle in set theory that allows for the selection of elements from different sets in a way that is not explicitly defined. This axiom is accepted in most forms of mathematics, but it leads to results like this one, which challenge our usual understanding of space and volume. The pieces in the Banach-Tarski Paradox are chosen in a way that defies normal measurement. They are broken down into infinitely many points, grouped into sets that cannot be assigned a clear volume. When rearranged, they fill up two spheres instead of one. To make sense of how something like this could happen, imagine a game where you are allowed to move pieces around according to certain rules. Suppose you have a magic puzzle that, when taken apart and reassembled in a different order, somehow doubles in size. If the pieces of the puzzle were normal, this would not work. But if the puzzle were made of infinitely scattered points, selected in a special way, the rules of normal geometry would no longer apply. The Banach-Tarski Paradox operates in a similar way, using the properties of infinite sets to achieve an impossible-seeming result. One way to approach this is to think about infinity itself. In everyday life, infinity is not something we deal with directly. You can have a very large number of objects, but you can always count them. However, in mathematics, infinity is a different kind of thing. It follows rules that do not always match our common sense. Consider an infinite hotel, known as Hilbert's Hotel, where every room is full, but new guests can always be accommodated by shifting everyone over one room. This kind of reasoning does not work in the real world, but in mathematical terms, it is valid. The Banach-Tarski Paradox works in a similar way, taking advantage of the strange properties of infinity. Another example of infinity behaving strangely comes from splitting an infinite set into smaller infinite sets. If you take all the even numbers and all the odd numbers separately, each of these sets still contains infinitely many numbers, even though you started with just one infinite set. The Banach-Tarski Paradox applies a similar idea to geometry, showing that an object in three-dimensional space can be split into parts that, when rearranged, produce two full copies of the original. The reason this paradox does not apply to real objects is that physical matter is made of atoms. Atoms are not infinitely divisible. If you try to cut a piece of wood into smaller and smaller parts, eventually you reach the atomic level, where further division would break the material into something unrecognizable. The Banach-Tarski Paradox assumes that the sphere is a perfect mathematical object with no atomic structure. It is an abstraction, not a real physical thing. This paradox also highlights a fundamental difference between mathematics and the physical world. In mathematics, objects exist according to rules and definitions. A perfect sphere is a set of points satisfying a certain equation. In the real world, no perfect sphere exists. Every ball, planet, or droplet of water has imperfections, atomic structure, and limits on how it can be manipulated. The Banach-Tarski Paradox applies to the idealized world of mathematical objects, not to anything we can actually hold in our hands. Many people react to this paradox with disbelief. It seems to suggest that you can create matter out of nothing. However, this is not what the paradox actually claims. It does not describe a process that could be carried out in reality. Instead, it reveals something surprising about the nature of mathematical space. It shows that the rules governing infinite sets in geometry allow for outcomes that contradict our experience. This result also connects to other strange ideas in mathematics, such as fractals. A fractal is a shape that looks similar at every level of magnification. The coastline of an island, when viewed from above, looks jagged, but as you zoom in, smaller details appear, and the pattern continues. Some fractals have infinite perimeter but finite area, another counterintuitive idea that challenges our understanding of space. The Banach-Tarski Paradox relies on sets that behave in a similarly unusual way. It is important to recognize that mathematics often produces results that seem paradoxical only because they contradict our everyday intuition. The Banach-Tarski Paradox does not mean that you can duplicate gold or create infinite resources. It is a statement about abstract objects, not physical materials. It belongs to a branch of mathematics called measure theory, which studies how size and volume are assigned to different sets. The paradox shows that, under certain conditions, volume is not always a well-defined concept. Mathematicians continue to explore the implications of this paradox and related ideas. Some versions of mathematics avoid the axiom of choice to prevent such paradoxes from occurring. Others accept the paradox as a natural consequence of working with infinite sets. Either way, it serves as a reminder that our intuition about space, volume, and quantity does not always align with the deeper rules that govern mathematical structures. Gabriel's horn is a shape that stretches infinitely while holding a strange mathematical property. It has a finite volume, but an infinite surface area. This leads to a paradox. If the shape has a finite volume, you could fill it with a finite amount of paint. But if it has an infinite surface area, you would never have enough paint to coat its inside. This contradiction challenges how we think about space and measurement. To picture Gabriel's horn, imagine a trumpet that starts with a wide opening but narrows as it stretches away. No matter how far it extends, it never quite closes. Mathematically, this shape comes from rotating the graph of the function y equals 1rx around the x-axis. The function starts high when x is small and approaches 0 as x increases. But no matter how far x goes, y never quite reaches 0. The result is a funnel-like shape that extends forever. Volume measures how much space something holds. Surface area measures how much space something covers. With most objects, if one is finite, the other is too. But Gabriel's horn breaks that expectation. When you calculate its volume, the numbers add up to a finite result. The further you go, the extra space gets so small that it adds up to a limit. This means that even though the horn stretches forever, it only takes a limited amount of paint to fill. The surface area tells a different story. As you move outward, the surface continues growing. The area never settles at a limit the way volume does. Instead, it keeps adding up without bound. No matter how much paint you have, you could never coat every bit of the surface. The paradox appears. You can fill the horn with paint, but you cannot coat the inside. To make this clearer, think of a simple cup. If the cup has a volume of 1 liter, you can pour in a liter of paint, and it will be full. If the cup has a surface area of 2 square meters, you need enough paint to cover that area. Now imagine a cup that stretches infinitely, getting narrower and narrower. It still holds a limited amount of paint because each extra bit adds less and less volume. But the surface keeps growing as you stretch further. That's Gabriel's horn. This seems impossible. How can an object hold paint but never be fully coated? The answer comes from how volume and area behave in infinity. When you add up the slices of volume, they shrink quickly enough that they settle at a limit. When you add up the slices of area, they shrink too, but not fast enough to stop growing. Infinity behaves differently in different situations. To understand this better, think of stacking papers. If each sheet is half the thickness of the one below it, you can stack an infinite number of sheets in a limited height. The top sheets become so thin that they barely add anything. That is similar to how Gabriel's horn has a finite volume. But if each sheet also had a little extra width, those widths could still add up forever. That is like the surface area. This paradox teaches something important about the way math models reality. In the real world, paint has thickness. Even the finest coat adds volume. If you tried to paint Gabriel's horn, the thickness of the paint would eventually fill it. This suggests that the paradox only exists in the abstract world of math. Real-world materials do not behave like perfect mathematical surfaces. Another way to see the paradox is through cost. Suppose you had a giant factory producing sheets of gold foil. You want to wrap Gabriel's horn. If your cost depends on volume, you only need a limited amount of gold. If your cost depends on surface area, you can never afford enough. The two numbers do not match in a way that seems logical. Infinity often leads to strange results. In everyday life, we do not deal with infinite shapes, but in mathematics, infinity appears in many places. Some infinite sets are larger than others, even though both are endless. Some infinite series add up to a finite number, while others do not. Gabriel's horn is an example of this kind of thinking applied to geometry. This paradox also connects to calculus. Calculus deals with sums that go on forever, called series. Some series approach a limit, while others grow without bound. The volume of Gabriel's horn follows a convergent series, which means it has a finite sum. The surface area follows a divergent series, which means it never stops growing. These differences explain why volume and surface behave so differently. In the real world, engineers and scientists work with concepts that involve very large numbers, but true infinity remains theoretical. No one builds infinite objects. But understanding these mathematical ideas helps solve problems in physics, engineering, and computer science. Whether calculating limits in a circuit or modeling the universe, the behavior of infinite sums is useful. Gabriel's horn reminds us that intuition does not always match reality. We expect an infinite object to be infinite in all ways, but that is not true here. The finite volume but infinite area seems impossible until you work through the math. Even then, it leaves a feeling of mystery. The world of infinity often defies expectations. Imagine you're on a game show. The host, Monty presents you with 3 doors. Behind one door is a car, and behind the other 2 are goats. Your goal is to pick the door with the car. You choose a door, let's say door 1. Before revealing what's behind it, the host, who knows where the car is, opens another door that has a goat. Now, only 2 doors remain. The host then offers you a choice. Stick with your original door or switch to the other one. What should you do? At first, it seems like it shouldn't matter whether you switch or stay. There are 2 doors left, and one must have the car. It feels like the odds should be 50-50. But that's not how probability works in this case. If you switch, your chances of winning jump to 2/3. If you stay, your chances remain 1/3. This seems counterintuitive, but breaking it down step by step makes it clear. When you first pick a door, you have a 1 in 3 chance of picking the car. That also means there is a 2 in 3 chance that the car is behind one of the other 2 doors. Since the host knows where the car is, he will always open a door with a goat. This is the key to why switching gives you a better chance. Think about it this way. Suppose you play this game 100 times. If you always stick with your original choice, you will win about 1/3 of the time. But if you always switch, you will win about 2/3 of the time. This is because, in most cases, your first choice is wrong. When you choose wrong, switching will always lead you to the car. Imagine a different version of the game to see why this works. Suppose there are 100 doors instead of 3. You pick one. The host, who knows where the car is, then opens 98 doors, all with goats. Now, only 2 doors remain, your original choice and one other. Would you still think the odds are 50-50? No. Your first pick was almost certainly wrong, so the remaining door is almost certainly the right one. The 3-door version works the same way, just on a smaller scale. Many people struggle with this problem because it contradicts their gut feeling. Our brains tend to assume that once a door is removed, the odds must reset, but they don't. The host's action is not random. He always removes a losing option, which gives you new information. In probability terms, this is called conditional probability. Your initial choice had a 1 in 3 chance of being correct, and that probability doesn't change just because a losing door was removed. Some people find it helpful to write out all possible outcomes. If you pick the car first, the host will still open a door with a goat, and switching will make you lose. But if you pick a goat first, the host will open the only other goat door, leaving the car behind the door you didn't pick. Since you're twice as likely to pick a goat at the start, switching wins 2/3 of the time. Even experienced mathematicians have struggled to accept this result. When Marilyn Vos-Savant, a writer known for her high IQ, explained the Monty problem in her magazine column, thousands of people, including PhDs, wrote in to argue she was wrong. Many insisted the probability should be 50-50, but computer simulations and real-world experiments confirm that switching is the better strategy. The Monty problem is an example of how human intuition often misjudges probability. It also shows the importance of updating beliefs when new information becomes available. Once the host opens a goat door, your initial choice is no longer just a random pick. You now have evidence that switching improves your odds. This problem has applications beyond game shows. In medicine, it helps explain why screening tests have false positives. In statistics, it illustrates how conditional probability works. In everyday life, it shows why it's important to reconsider choices when new information appears. To make this even clearer, imagine playing a simpler version of the game. Suppose you don't pick a door at all. Instead, the host gives you the option to choose between two groups. One group contains one door and the other contains two. If you were forced to pick a group instead of a specific door, wouldn't you choose the larger group? That's exactly what switching does. It gives you the benefit of a 2 in 3 chance instead of 1 in 3. If you ever find yourself in this situation, ignore your instincts and switch. The math says you'll win more often, even if it doesn't feel that way. You sit at a table with 2 identical envelopes in front of you. A person tells you that one envelope contains twice the amount of money as the other. You pick one at random. Before you open it, the person gives you a choice. You can keep your envelope or switch to the other one. At first, this seems like a simple decision. You picked an envelope randomly, so there is no reason to think switching would make a difference. But then you start thinking about the possible amounts inside. Suppose the envelope you picked contains some amount of money, which we will call X. That means the other envelope must contain either twice that amount or half that amount. Since you do not know which is true, you assume each possibility has an equal chance of being correct. Now you calculate the expected value of switching. The expected value is the average amount you might get if you switched many times under these conditions. To do this, you multiply each possible amount in the other envelope by its probability. The first possibility is that the other envelope contains twice X. If this is the case, switching gives you 2 times X. The second possibility is that the other envelope contains half X. If this is the case, switching gives you half X. Since each possibility is equally likely, meaning each has a probability of 1/2, you multiply these amounts by 1/2 and add them together. First, take 1/2 times 2 times X. This gives you 1 times X. Then take 1/2 times 1/2 times X. This gives you 1/4 times X. Add these two results together. 1 times X plus 1/4 times X equals 1 and 1/4 times X. This result suggests that switching increases your expected amount to 1 and 1/4 times what you currently have, but that does not make sense. If switching is always the best option, then no matter which envelope you originally chose, switching would always be better. That means if you had chosen the other envelope first, you would again be told to switch back. But both envelopes cannot be better than each other at the same time. That is the paradox. At first glance, the problem seems to be in the calculation. You assumed that the chance of the other envelope containing twice X or half X was equal, meaning both had a probability of 1/2. But that assumption is incorrect. The actual probability depends on how the money was placed into the envelopes in the first place. If a person first chose a random number and then put half in one envelope and double in the other, the math changes. The expected value depends on the distribution of possible amounts rather than just on the relative values of the envelopes. Think of it in a different way. Suppose one envelope contains $10 and the other contains $20. You pick an envelope, but you do not know which one you have. The paradox says that no matter which you picked, you should switch. If you pick the envelope with $10, switching gives you $20, which seems like a good move. But if you pick the envelope with $20, switching gives you $10, which is worse. The expected value calculation suggests that switching is always better, but in reality, it is not. You are just as likely to lose money as to gain money. A common mistake in the reasoning is treating X as a fixed amount when it actually depends on which envelope you picked. If your envelope contains the smaller amount, the other has twice as much. If your envelope contains the larger amount, the other has half as much. But you do not know which situation you are in. The expected value argument assumes that X represents the same thing in both cases, which it does not. The paradox appears in other forms. A similar problem is sometimes called the exchange paradox, where two people each start with an unknown amount of money and are given the option to trade. If each person believes they are more likely to gain than lose, they should always trade. But if both follow this logic, they keep trading forever, even though they have no reason to expect a benefit. This paradox also connects to probability in real-world decisions. When people face uncertainty, they often rely on expected values to make choices. But expected value only works when probabilities are assigned correctly. If the distribution of possible outcomes is unclear, calculations can mislead. In gambling, investing, and other decisions involving risk, people sometimes fall into the same flawed reasoning that the two envelopes paradox reveals. The paradox has inspired many debates in probability theory and decision theory. Some argue that the problem is simply a mistake in probability calculation. Others suggest that it exposes a deeper issue in how people think about uncertainty. Many proposed solutions involve changing how the problem is framed. One approach is to fix a starting amount and then decide how to fill the envelopes. Another is to assume that the total money in both envelopes is chosen first, rather than a single amount being doubled or halved. Some versions of the paradox try to avoid this issue by adding extra rules. One approach is to limit the possible amounts of money to a specific set of values, such as only using powers of 2. For example, the envelopes could contain $1, $2, $4, or $8. This avoids the problem of defining X incorrectly. Another way is to use a different probability distribution instead of assuming each possible outcome is equally likely. Despite these solutions, the paradox remains an interesting problem in probability and decision-making. It challenges assumptions about fairness, randomness, and expected value. Even if the paradox is based on a mistake, that mistake is one people often make in real life. Imagine a librarian who is tasked with creating a catalog of all books that do not list themselves. The librarian follows one rule: any book that includes itself in its list is not included. If a book does not include itself, it is added to the catalog. Now, the librarian wonders whether the catalog itself should be listed. If it is included, it breaks the rule because it would contain itself. If it is not included, then it meets the rule's criteria and should be added. This contradiction is the essence of Russell's paradox. Bertrand Russell formulated this paradox in the early 20th century when he examined how mathematical sets work. A set is simply a collection of objects, and mathematicians were attempting to define sets logically. Some sets contain themselves, while others do not. Russell asked what happens if you define a set that includes all sets that do not contain themselves. This question seems simple, but it leads to an unavoidable contradiction. To illustrate, consider everyday sets. A set of apples contains only apples. A set of books contains only books. Some sets seem to logically contain themselves. The set of all things that are not books would include itself because it is not a book. Other sets do not contain themselves. The set of all dogs does not contain itself because it is not a dog. Russell's question asks whether a set that contains only sets that do not contain themselves should include itself. If it does, it breaks its own rule. If it does not, then it should be included. This logical loop has no clear resolution. This paradox arises from self-referential definitions. The problem is not the idea of sets, but the way the rule is constructed. Any set that follows this definition ends up contradicting itself. This issue is not just theoretical. At the time, mathematicians believed that defining sets this way provided a solid foundation for mathematics. Russell's discovery showed that there was a fundamental problem in this approach. This paradox has implications beyond mathematics. In language, similar contradictions occur. If someone says, "I always lie," can that statement be true? If it is true, then they must be lying, which makes it false. If it is false, then they must be telling the truth, which contradicts the statement. This self-referential loop mirrors Russell's paradox. Another real-world analogy is in legal rules. Imagine a law that states, all laws that do not apply to themselves must be reviewed annually. If this law does not apply to itself, then it must be reviewed, which means it does apply to itself. If it does apply to itself, then it should not be reviewed, contradicting its requirement. This shows how self-referential definitions can create contradictions in any system that relies on strict logical rules. Russell's discovery led to changes in how mathematics approaches set theory. Mathematicians realized that unrestricted definitions could lead to contradictions, making logical foundations unstable. To fix this, they introduced new rules that prevent sets from being defined in ways that cause self-referential loops. These adjustments made modern set theory more rigorous and consistent. This paradox also appears in computer science. In programming, self-referential functions or infinite loops can cause software to crash or behave unpredictably. A function that calls itself under certain conditions can end up in a cycle that never stops. Programmers must design systems carefully to avoid unintended contradictions like the one Russell described. A more practical example can be found in organizations. Imagine a committee that oversees all committees that do not oversee themselves. Should this committee oversee itself? If it does, then it is not a committee that only oversees others. If it does not, then it meets the definition and must oversee itself. This paradox can arise in bureaucracy, where rules create conflicts in how authority is structured. Russell's paradox reveals the limitations of certain types of logical systems. It highlights how self-referential definitions can create contradictions that seem impossible to resolve. This discovery forced mathematicians, philosophers, and logicians to rethink how they define rules and categories to avoid such contradictions. The twin paradox is a thought experiment in special relativity that reveals how time behaves differently for objects moving at different speeds. It describes a situation where one twin stays on Earth while the other travels at nearly the speed of light and then returns. When they reunite, the traveling twin is younger than the twin who remained on Earth. This result seems counterintuitive, but it follows directly from Einstein's theory of special relativity. To understand this paradox, consider two twins, Alex and Jordan. Alex stays on Earth while Jordan boards a spaceship that travels to a distant star and back at nearly the speed of light. From Alex's perspective, Jordan is moving quickly through space. Special relativity states that moving clocks run slower than stationary ones. Because of this, Alex expects Jordan's clock to tick more slowly. If the journey lasts 50 years for Alex, they expect Jordan's clock to show less than 50 years. The confusion arises when considering Jordan's perspective. From their point of view, it looks like Alex is the one moving while they remain at rest inside the spaceship. Special relativity states that motion is relative, so Jordan might expect Alex's clock to be the one running slower. If both clocks run slower than the other, how can one twin actually age less? This apparent contradiction is why the situation is called a paradox, but the answer becomes clear when looking at the details. The key is that the situation is not perfectly symmetrical. Alex remains in one place the entire time, while Jordan accelerates, turns around, and returns. This acceleration and change in direction mean Jordan's experience is different from Alex's. Special relativity applies to objects moving at constant speeds relative to each other. When Jordan turns around, they are no longer moving at a constant speed. This break in symmetry explains why Jordan ages less than Alex. A helpful way to understand this effect is through time dilation. Time dilation means that time moves more slowly for objects moving close to the speed of light. The faster an object moves, the greater the effect. If Jordan's spaceship moves at 99% of the speed of light, the time experienced on the ship will be much less than the time experienced on Earth. If Jordan's trip to the distant star and back takes 50 years on Earth, the time experienced on the ship might be only a few years. This effect has been tested with real experiments. Scientists have placed atomic clocks on airplanes and sent them around the world. When compared to identical clocks that remained on the ground, the moving clocks showed slightly less time had passed. This confirms that motion slows down time, just as Einstein predicted. To get a better sense of the numbers involved, consider an example. Suppose the distant star is 10 light-years away, and Jordan's spaceship travels at 99.9% of the speed of light. From Alex's perspective, the round trip takes just over 20 years because the ship covers 20 light-years at nearly the speed of light. However, Jordan experiences much less time. The time dilation formula shows that for Jordan, only about 1 year passes on the spaceship. When Jordan returns, Alex has aged 20 years while Jordan has only aged 1 year. This effect is not an illusion. It is a real difference in how much time each twin experiences. The faster Jordan travels, the greater the time difference. If Jordan could travel even closer to the speed of light, they might return after what felt like only days or hours, while decades passed for Alex. This result challenges common ideas about time. It suggests that time is not absolute, but instead depends on motion. It also shows that traveling at high speeds could allow someone to move forward in time relative to people who remain stationary. If future technology allows for near light speed travel, a person could travel far into the future while experiencing very little time themselves. One important detail is that this effect only becomes noticeable at extremely high speeds. Everyday movements do not create enough time dilation for people to notice. A person walking or driving a car does experience time more slowly than someone standing still, but the difference is too small to measure without precise instruments. However, satellites and spacecraft move fast enough that time dilation must be considered for accurate calculations. The paradox also raises questions about what happens at the turnaround point. Some people wonder if the acceleration at this point is what causes the difference in aging. However, the acceleration itself is not the main factor. The key issue is that Jordan switches from one reference frame to another. Before turning around, Jordan is moving away from Earth. After turning around, they are moving toward Earth. Each reference frame measures time differently, and switching between them results in the observed time difference. Some versions of the paradox suggest that if Jordan never turned around but continued moving indefinitely, both twins could claim the other is aging more slowly. This would be true as long as they remain in separate, constant motion. The paradox only resolves when the twins reunite. The moment they meet again, the actual difference in experienced time becomes clear. Einstein's theories describe the universe in ways that often seem strange compared to everyday experiences. The twin paradox is one of many examples where relativity challenges intuition. It shows that time is flexible and depends on speed. The faster someone moves, the slower they experience time. This has practical applications in technology, including the need to adjust GPS satellite clocks because they move fast enough to experience time slightly differently from clocks on Earth. Scientists continue exploring these ideas by studying objects that move at high speeds, such as particles in accelerators. These particles experience time dilation exactly as predicted. The same principle applies to astronauts on the International Space Station, who experience time a tiny bit more slowly than people on Earth. Although the effect is small at current speeds, it would become dramatic at near light speeds. Some science fiction stories explore the consequences of this paradox. A common theme is that astronauts traveling on long missions might return to find that much more time has passed on Earth. This concept appears in many books and films, illustrating how relativity allows for a kind of time travel into the future. The twin paradox is not a true paradox in the sense of an unsolvable contradiction. It follows directly from the principles of relativity, and its effects have been confirmed through experiments. The key to understanding it is recognizing that the twin who travels is not in the same situation as the twin who stays on Earth. Because of this, time passes differently for them, leading to the surprising but real result that the traveling twin returns younger. The universe is vast. It holds billions of galaxies, each containing billions of stars. Many of these stars have planets, and some of those planets may have conditions similar to Earth. Given these numbers, it seems logical that intelligent life should exist elsewhere. If that is true, then where is everyone? This question is known as the Fermi Paradox. The paradox arises because our galaxy alone has hundreds of billions of stars. Even if intelligent life developed on a small percentage of planets, the number of civilizations should still be high. If those civilizations lasted long enough to develop advanced technology, they should be capable of exploring space. Some of them should have sent signals. Some should have built structures we can detect. Yet despite decades of searching, we have found no clear signs of extraterrestrial intelligence. One possible explanation is that intelligent life is rare. Life on Earth may have resulted from a unique series of events. Simple organisms existed on Earth for billions of years before complex life emerged. If that process requires extremely rare conditions, then intelligent life may not develop often. There could be billions of planets with bacteria-like organisms, but very few with advanced civilizations. Another possibility is that intelligent civilizations destroy themselves before they reach the stage of interstellar travel. This idea is known as the Great Filter. The filter could be in the past, meaning that the emergence of intelligent life is the hard part. Or it could be in the future, meaning that civilizations tend to collapse before they become spacefaring. If the second case is true, then the reason we do not see intelligent life may be that it does not survive long enough to make contact. Self-destruction could take many forms. A civilization might develop weapons powerful enough to destroy itself. It might deplete its planet's resources and collapse before reaching the stars. It might create artificial intelligence that turns against it. Any of these scenarios could explain why we do not see signs of intelligent life. Another possibility is that intelligent civilizations exist but avoid contact. They might observe us without revealing themselves. They might follow a rule similar to the prime directive in science fiction, choosing not to interfere with less advanced civilizations. If Earth is being watched, then any evidence of extraterrestrial life would be hidden from us. A more unsettling idea is that advanced civilizations actively prevent new civilizations from emerging. In this scenario, any civilization that reaches a certain level of technology becomes a threat. Older civilizations might destroy them before they become powerful. This would mean that the reason we do not see extraterrestrial life is that intelligent species do not last long once they develop space travel. It is also possible that signals from intelligent life are too weak or too different for us to recognize. Human technology is limited. Most of our searches rely on radio signals, but extraterrestrial civilizations might use different forms of communication. They might communicate using signals that we cannot detect or do not understand. If that is the case, then we could be surrounded by intelligent civilizations without realizing it. Another explanation is that space is simply too big. Even if intelligent civilizations exist, the distance between them might be enormous. Signals take time to travel. The Milky Way is about 100,000 light-years across. If a civilization sent a signal 50,000 years ago, it might not have reached us yet. If they sent it in a direction we are not looking, we would never detect it. Our searches are limited, and we may have missed signals simply because we have not looked in the right place. Time is another factor. Civilizations may rise and fall at different times. The universe is about 13.8 billion years old. If intelligent life existed a billion years ago and disappeared, we would not know. If it appears a billion years from now, we will not be here to see it. The chances of two civilizations existing at the same time and detecting each other may be low. Some theories suggest that extraterrestrial civilizations exist, but live in ways that make them hard to detect. They might live in environments that do not produce recognizable signals. They might exist in virtual worlds, choosing to upload their consciousness instead of exploring space. If intelligent life finds a way to live without expanding outward, we would not see it. There is also the possibility that we are the first intelligent civilization to reach this level of technology. Someone has to be first. If intelligent life is rare and we developed earlier than others, then we might be the first species to reach the stage of searching for others. If that is true, then later civilizations might one day detect us instead of the other way around. Some suggest that extraterrestrial life does not expand outward because space travel is too difficult. Even if civilizations exist, they may not have the ability to travel between stars. The distances involved are immense, and the energy required is beyond what we can currently produce. If every civilization struggles with these same limitations, then interstellar travel may be impractical for all of them. Another theory is that intelligent civilizations communicate in ways that do not leave a lasting mark. Humans leave traces of their existence, but a more advanced civilization might not. They might use energy efficiently in ways that do not produce signals we can detect. If that is the case, then the universe could be filled with intelligent life, but we have no way of knowing. Some have proposed that the search for extraterrestrial life has not gone on long enough to yield results. We have only been listening for signals for a few decades. The search for life beyond Earth is still in its early stages. New technologies might eventually provide answers. More powerful telescopes, better detection methods, and further exploration of exoplanets could reveal signs of intelligent life in the future. Another explanation is that extraterrestrial civilizations do not use radio signals for communication. Our own technology is shifting toward more efficient methods, and radio signals may become obsolete. If extraterrestrial civilizations went through a similar transition long ago, then the period in which they used detectable radio signals may have been brief. If that is true, then we may have missed their signals entirely. It is possible that extraterrestrial life is present in our own solar system, but has not been recognized. Microbial life could exist on Mars, Europa, or Enceladus. If life is common but does not develop intelligence, then the Fermi Paradox is less of a mystery. Intelligent life may be rare, while simpler forms of life may be abundant. Some suggest that our understanding of life itself is too limited. We search for life as we know it based on carbon and water. But life could exist in forms beyond our comprehension. If that is the case, then extraterrestrial life might be all around us, but we do not recognize it because it does not fit our expectations. One final idea is that the Fermi Paradox is not a paradox at all. It assumes that intelligent life should be detectable, but that assumption may be flawed. If extraterrestrial civilizations exist, but do not behave in ways that produce signals we can find, then there is no contradiction. The lack of evidence may not mean they are absent. It may only mean that we have not found the right way to look. Schrödinger's cat is a famous thought experiment that challenges how we understand quantum mechanics. It was created by physicist Erwin Schrödinger in 1935 to highlight the strange nature of quantum theory. The idea is simple but leads to a bizarre situation where a cat can be both alive and dead at the same time. Imagine a sealed box with a cat inside. Along with the cat, there is a small amount of radioactive material. This material has a 50% chance of decaying within an hour. If it decays, a Geiger counter detects it, triggering a mechanism that releases poison gas, killing the cat. If the material does not decay, nothing happens, and the cat remains alive. The box is completely sealed, so no one can see what is happening inside. According to quantum mechanics, before opening the box, the cat is in a superposition of states, both alive and dead. Only when someone looks inside does the cat become one or the other. This idea comes from quantum superposition, which means that particles exist in multiple states at once until they are measured. In the microscopic world, electrons, photons, and other tiny particles do not have definite positions or speeds until they are observed. Instead, they exist in a range of possibilities. Schrödinger took this idea and applied it to something as familiar as a cat to show how strange it is. In everyday life, things are either one way or another. A light is either on or off. A door is either open or closed. A cat is either alive or dead. But in quantum mechanics, particles do not follow these rules. Instead, they exist in many states at once until measured. This is called the Copenhagen interpretation, and it is one of the main ideas in quantum theory. It suggests that observation causes a system to settle into one definite outcome. The thought experiment raises an important question. When does something stop being in superposition and become one definite thing? Is it when the atom decays? When the poison is released? When the cat reacts? Or only when a person opens the box? If the cat is truly both alive and dead before the box is opened, does that mean reality depends on whether someone is looking? To make this idea more understandable, imagine flipping a coin, but not looking at it. While it is in the air, it has a chance of landing on heads or tails. If you cover it before it lands, you do not know the result. In classical physics, the coin already has a definite outcome, even if you do not know what it is. In quantum mechanics, it is different. The coin does not have one outcome until it is observed. Until then, it exists in a mix of both possibilities. This is why Schrödinger's cat is so strange. If quantum rules apply to everything, then a large object like a cat should also follow these rules. But in everyday life, we never see things existing in two states at once. This is where the paradox comes in. Either quantum mechanics only applies to tiny particles, or our understanding of observation is incomplete. Some scientists believe that observation itself forces a system to choose one state. Others think that quantum systems interact with their surroundings, which causes them to settle into a definite outcome before being observed. This is called decoherence. It suggests that even if we do not look, the cat's environment, such as air molecules, temperature, or even the box itself, pushes it into one state or the other. There is another interpretation called the many worlds theory. It suggests that when the box is opened, the universe splits into two versions, one where the cat is alive and one where the cat is dead. In this view, both outcomes happen, but in different branches of reality. This means every quantum event creates multiple universes, each with a different version of events. The Schrödinger's cat paradox has been tested in experiments using small particles. Scientists have placed molecules in states of superposition, where they exist in two places at once. These experiments confirm that quantum superposition is real at the microscopic level. However, applying it to large objects remains difficult. No one has observed a living thing in a true quantum superposition. The thought experiment is not just a puzzle. It raises deep questions about reality, observation, and the role of consciousness in physics. Does looking at something change its nature? Is the universe truly uncertain until observed? Or do things exist in definite states regardless of whether anyone is watching? Schrödinger did not intend for the cat to be taken literally. Instead, he wanted to show the limits of quantum mechanics and how strange its implications are when applied to the real world. Understanding Schrödinger's cat means questioning how reality works at its most fundamental level. If quantum theory applies to everything, then superposition should be part of everyday life. But if the cat is never truly both alive and dead, then there may be hidden rules that prevent quantum effects from affecting large objects. This is why the paradox remains one of the most thought-provoking ideas in physics. Imagine a box filled with gas molecules moving in different directions. Some molecules move fast, while others move slow. The box is divided into two halves by a wall. In this wall, there is a small door that can open and close at will. Now, imagine a tiny being, often called Maxwell's demon, standing at this door. The demon observes each molecule as it approaches and makes a decision. If a fast-moving molecule comes near, the demon lets it pass to the right side of the box. If a slow-moving molecule approaches, the demon allows it to enter the left side. Over time, something strange happens. The right side of the box fills with fast-moving molecules, while the left side collects slow-moving ones. This means the right side becomes hotter and the left side becomes cooler. Heat has moved from one side to the other without any work being done. This appears to violate the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy or disorder should always increase in an isolated system. If the demon can separate the fast and slow molecules like this, then it seems possible to reduce entropy and create a temperature difference without expending energy. This idea, introduced by James Clerk Maxwell in 1867, challenges one of the fundamental principles of physics. The second law of thermodynamics is a key part of how energy works in nature. It explains why heat flows from hot to cold and why machines cannot be perfectly efficient. If Maxwell's demon could actually function, it would mean that energy could be harnessed endlessly without any loss, contradicting everything we understand about thermodynamics. To understand why this is a problem, consider a refrigerator. A fridge keeps food cold by using energy to transfer heat from inside the fridge to the surrounding environment. It requires a compressor and an external power source to perform this work. But if Maxwell's demon existed, it could separate fast and slow molecules without using energy, essentially creating a perfect cooling system with no need for an external power supply. This would mean perpetual motion machines could exist, something that the laws of physics say is impossible. The paradox lies in the fact that Maxwell's demon seems to break these fundamental rules. It suggests that entropy, or disorder, could decrease naturally, contradicting the idea that all systems tend toward greater disorder over time. Scientists spent years trying to understand how this idea fits with real-world physics. One possible explanation comes from the concept of information. The demon needs to measure the speed of each molecule before deciding whether to open the door. This means it must gather, process, and store information. But doing this requires energy. The act of recording and erasing information generates entropy, counteracting the decrease that results from sorting the molecules. This idea, proposed by physicist Léon Brillouin and later expanded by Rolf Landauer, suggests that any advantage the demon gains is canceled out by the cost of processing information. To see how information links to entropy, think about a computer. Every time a computer erases data or resets a memory register, it releases heat. The same principle applies to Maxwell's demon. As it collects and organizes information about molecules, it must eventually erase or overwrite that data, which produces entropy. In other words, the demon cannot cheat the laws of physics because the work it does to store and process information offsets any reduction in entropy it achieves. Another way to examine the paradox is through modern statistical mechanics. In a gas, individual molecules move randomly, but their collective behavior follows predictable patterns. The demon does not change the total energy of the system, only its distribution. But to act effectively, it must measure and control individual particles, which is impractical in real-world conditions. Real molecules are affected by countless tiny influences, making it impossible to maintain perfect control over them. Any attempt to do so would introduce external energy, rebalancing entropy. Even if a version of Maxwell's demon could exist, its impact would be limited. Practical applications of energy always involve some form of dissipation, whether through friction, resistance, or inefficiencies in measurement. The demon does not remove these fundamental limitations. Instead, it highlights the delicate balance between information, energy, and entropy. Some researchers have explored whether Maxwell's demon could have practical applications in nanotechnology or computing. In highly controlled environments, sorting individual particles with minimal energy input is possible on small scales. However, this does not overturn the laws of thermodynamics. It only shows that under very specific conditions, entropy can decrease locally while increasing elsewhere in a system. The paradox also influences discussions in quantum mechanics. In quantum systems, particles behave in strange ways, sometimes existing in multiple states at once. The way information is measured and stored at the quantum level affects entropy in ways still being explored. Some scientists have proposed using quantum principles to create Maxwell's demon-like devices that manipulate energy flows more efficiently than classical systems. Though Maxwell's demon remains a thought experiment, it has led to real-world insights. It has helped physicists better understand the relationship between entropy and information, influencing fields ranging from computing to thermodynamics. The paradox serves as a reminder that even simple ideas can reveal deep truths about how the universe works. Zeno's paradoxes challenge the way we think about motion and time. The most famous is Achilles and the tortoise. Imagine a race where Achilles, a fast runner, gives a slow-moving tortoise a head start. Common sense tells us Achilles will catch up quickly, but Zeno argues otherwise. He says that to catch the tortoise, Achilles must first reach the point where the tortoise started. By the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved forward a little. Achilles then has to reach this new position, but again, the tortoise has moved slightly ahead. This cycle repeats infinitely, suggesting that Achilles can never actually pass the tortoise. Yet in reality, we see faster runners overtake slower ones all the time. Another paradox is the dichotomy paradox. Suppose you want to walk to a wall. To reach it, you must first cover half the distance. Once you do, you must then cover half of the remaining distance. Then, you must cover half of that distance again. This process continues infinitely, with each step getting smaller but never reaching zero. Since you must complete an infinite number of steps, Zeno argues that movement itself should be impossible. Despite this reasoning, people walk across rooms, drive cars, and travel across the world every day. The arrow paradox presents a different problem. Zeno argues that if you look at an arrow in flight at any single instant, it is motionless in that moment. If every single moment is frozen like this, then motion is just a series of still images stacked together. If each image is still, how does motion arise? This paradox suggests that motion is an illusion, even though our senses tell us otherwise. These paradoxes depend on the idea of infinite division. If space and time can be broken down into smaller and smaller parts forever, then motion involves completing an infinite sequence of tasks. Since completing an infinite number of steps seems impossible, Zeno concludes that motion itself cannot happen. Yet everything we experience contradicts this claim. Mathematicians have found ways to explain these paradoxes using modern tools. Calculus, developed by Newton and Leibniz, provides one way to resolve the problem. A sum of infinite numbers can have a finite result. For example, if you add 1/2, then 1/4, then 1/8, and continue forever, the total approaches 1. This means that even though Achilles has an infinite number of points to reach, the total time he takes can still be finite. Using calculus, the paradox vanishes because infinite steps do not necessarily mean infinite time. Physics also provides answers. In the real world, time is not infinitely divisible at the smallest scales. Quantum mechanics suggests that time and space have a fundamental limit, called the Planck scale. This means that at some point, space and time can no longer be divided further. If there is a smallest possible unit of movement, then Zeno's infinite division does not apply to reality. Despite these solutions, the paradoxes still raise important questions. They show that our understanding of motion relies on assumptions about space and time. If motion is continuous, then how do we resolve infinite division? If motion consists of distinct steps, then what happens in between them? These questions lead to deeper discussions in philosophy, physics, and mathematics. Another way to think about Zeno's paradoxes is through digital screens. A video or animation appears smooth, but it is actually made of individual frames. If you pause a video, each frame looks like a still image. If motion is just a sequence of frames, is it truly continuous? This is similar to Zeno's arrow paradox, yet we perceive smooth motion, just as we see real-world movement despite the paradoxes. Computers handle similar problems when simulating motion. A computer program must break time into small steps to calculate changes. If time were truly continuous, a computer would need infinite calculations to simulate even a single second. Instead, it uses small intervals that are close enough to continuous motion for practical purposes. This approach mirrors how calculus handles infinite steps in a finite time. Zeno's paradoxes also relate to decision-making. Suppose you are trying to reach a goal. You first complete part of the task, then half of the remaining work, then half of that. If you always focus on the remaining work, it may feel like you never finish. This is similar to the dichotomy paradox, where infinite steps seem to prevent completion. Yet in reality, progress adds up, and tasks do get finished. In economics, these ideas appear in diminishing returns. If a company invests in improvements, each additional step might bring smaller benefits. If improvements shrink over time, does progress ever truly complete? This reflects the idea of approaching a limit, just as Achilles gets infinitely closer to the tortoise but still overtakes it in reality. Zeno's paradoxes remind us that intuition does not always match logic. They challenge the way we think about motion, time, and reality. Even though we can resolve them with calculus and physics, they still spark discussions in philosophy, science, and everyday reasoning. A donkey stands in an open field, motionless. To its left is a pile of hay. To its right is another pile, identical in size, smell, and distance. The donkey is hungry. It has no preference for one pile over the other. Logically, it should eat. But which pile should it choose? If both are equally good and there is no reason to prefer one over the other, the donkey finds itself stuck. Unable to decide, it remains still. Time passes. Its hunger grows, but without a reason to move in either direction, it does nothing. Eventually, the donkey starves. This scenario is known as Buridan's ass, named after the 14th century philosopher John Buridan. The paradox raises a simple, yet troubling question about decision-making. If faced with two equally good choices and no rational reason to favor one, what happens? Do we choose at random, or do we freeze, unable to act? Imagine a person scrolling through a movie streaming service. They see two films they want to watch, both equally appealing. They spend minutes, sometimes longer, stuck in indecision. The longer they wait, the more frustrated they become. The indecision itself becomes a problem. Even though neither choice is bad, they struggle to pick one. The person is not physically starving like the donkey, but they are experiencing a mental block. A a smaller version of the same dilemma. This paradox challenges a key assumption about rational decision-making. In theory, a rational being should always act in a way that benefits them. If a donkey is hungry and two food sources are available, it should eat. But when logic does not offer a clear answer, rationality itself seems to break down. The paradox suggests that pure reason alone is sometimes not enough to make decisions. In real life, people rarely face situations where two choices are completely identical. There are usually small differences. One movie might have slightly better reviews. One path to work might have a nicer view. Even if the differences are minor, they give the brain a way to make a decision. The donkey in the paradox is unusual because its choices are perfectly balanced. In the real world, perfect balance is rare. But that does not mean decision paralysis does not happen. Imagine a student choosing between two universities. Both offer the same major, have similar reputations, and cost about the same. The student wants to make the best choice but struggles. They make lists of pros and cons, but neither option clearly wins. The more they think, the harder it becomes to decide. They worry that if they choose randomly, they might regret it later. They delay making the choice. The deadline approaches. If they do not act, they risk missing both opportunities. Buridan's ass is not just about physical hunger. It applies to any decision where options seem equally good. People face this kind of decision paralysis all the time. Someone in a restaurant stares at a menu, unable to pick between two dishes. A job seeker gets two offers and agonizes over which to accept. A shopper in a store sees two nearly identical shirts and spends far too long trying to choose one. The fear of making the wrong choice can lead to no choice at all. In the real world, decisions have consequences. Unlike the donkey, humans often recognize that not choosing is itself a choice. If the student does not pick a school, the schools will pick for them by closing their admissions. If the job seeker delays too long, both employers might move on to other candidates. If the shopper spends an hour choosing between two shirts, they are losing time they could have spent elsewhere. Recognizing that inaction has consequences can help break the paralysis. Some philosophers argue that real decision-making is not as logical as the paradox suggests. In many cases, people do not make choices based on pure reason. They rely on instinct, habit, or emotion. A person might pick a university because a friend goes there, or choose a meal because they feel like having pasta that day. Sometimes, people simply go with their gut. The paradox assumes that rational choice is the only factor in decision-making, but in reality, people often act based on intuition. Consider an athlete deciding whether to take a shot in a game. If they hesitate, they might miss their chance. If they overanalyze, they might lose confidence. The best athletes do not freeze when faced with two options. They make a quick decision and commit to it. This instinctive decision-making is what helps them succeed. Overthinking can sometimes be worse than making a slightly imperfect choice. In economics, Buridan's ass relates to consumer behavior. Companies often struggle with how many choices to give customers. If they offer too few, people might feel restricted. If they offer too many, customers might struggle to decide and end up buying nothing. A store with 20 brands of toothpaste might sell less than a store with only 5 options. Too many choices can overwhelm people. When everything seems equally good, making no decision feels easier. Technology companies design their products to reduce decision paralysis. Streaming services suggest movies based on past viewing history. Online stores recommend products so customers do not have to browse endlessly. Restaurants highlight best sellers to guide people toward a choice. These tactics help prevent the kind of indecision that the paradox describes. The paradox also connects to psychology. Some people experience analysis paralysis more than others. Perfectionists struggle with decisions because they want to make the best possible choice. Fear of regret can make even simple choices feel overwhelming. In extreme cases, people avoid making choices at all, letting circumstances decide for them. Understanding this tendency can help people learn to make decisions more effectively. One way to overcome decision paralysis is to introduce a small arbitrary factor. If the donkey in the paradox had a slight preference, maybe one pile of hay was a little closer, it would break the tie. In real life, people do this all the time. A student choosing between two schools might decide based on weather, even if that is not the most logical factor. A diner choosing between two meals might pick the one they have not tried before. The key is to create a reason, even if it is small. Another way to avoid the paradox is to recognize that in most cases, both choices are good. If both universities are equally strong, the student will likely be happy at either one. If both job offers are attractive, both can lead to a successful career. Realizing that there may not be a single right choice can reduce the stress of decision-making. People often treat decisions as permanent when they are not. Someone who chooses one job can switch later. A diner who picks one meal can order the other next time. Many choices are reversible or have ways to adapt after they are made. Recognizing this can make decision-making easier. Buridan's ass is a simple story, but it highlights a deep problem in logic and human behavior. When two options seem equally good, choosing can feel impossible. But in reality, hesitation can be more harmful than making an imperfect choice. Recognizing that inaction is a choice can help people move forward. Sometimes the best way to decide is simply to decide. The friendship paradox is a strange but simple idea. It states that, on average, your friends have more friends than you do. This might sound wrong at first. Most people assume their social circles are typical. But when you look at how networks work, the paradox makes sense. Imagine a small town where people have different numbers of friends. Some are popular and know many people. Others have only a few close friends. If you pick a person at random, that person is more likely to be connected to someone with many friends rather than someone with few. This is because popular people appear in more people's friend groups. Think about a college campus. A student with only 2 friends is less likely to be chosen randomly in a network than a student with 50. If you meet a new person, they are more likely to be well connected. This means the average number of friends among your friends is often higher than your own number of friends. This paradox happens because of the way friendships form. A person with many connections is included in more friend groups. They are seen more often, invited to more gatherings, and mentioned in more conversations. This doesn't mean that every individual is less popular than their friends. Some people have more friends than their average friend count. But for most, the pattern holds. Social networks have structure. Some people act as hubs, bringing different groups together. Others have only a few links. If you look at a network, it resembles a web. Some points have many connections, while others have only 1 or 2. When you pick a random person, they are more likely to be near one of these central hubs. This creates the illusion that most people are less connected than their peers. The effect is more visible on social media. Platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter show the friendship paradox clearly. People with many followers appear in more feeds. A person who follows a few accounts is likely to see posts from people with large followings. This makes it seem like everyone else is more connected. This paradox affects how people see their social lives. If someone feels their friends are more outgoing or socially active, this effect could be at play. It may seem like others are always at events, meeting new people, and expanding their networks. But this is partly a matter of perspective. People with many friends naturally appear in more places. This also applies to professional networks. In a workplace, some employees know everyone, while others keep to smaller circles. If someone networks widely, they are likely to be connected to colleagues with large networks. A person who attends a few events may think that others are better connected. But the paradox suggests that this perception is influenced by the way networks are structured. Even in schools, the friendship paradox plays a role. A student who is not very social may feel that their classmates are more connected. This can lead to feelings of being left out. But in reality, most students see a similar effect. Their classmates may appear to have many more friends because they see the most connected people more often. Another way to think about this paradox is through clubs or organizations. In any large group, a few people will be more central. They will know more members, organize more activities, and be more visible. If someone joins a club and feels that others are more involved, it might not be because they are less active. Instead, they are seeing the most connected members more frequently. The friendship paradox also applies to social trends. If a behavior spreads through a network, it often reaches the most connected individuals first. These people influence others, making it seem like an idea is more popular than it is. This happens with fashion, slang, and even political opinions. If a new trend emerges, it might appear that everyone is following it, but this could be because the most visible people adopt it first. Public figures also experience this paradox. Celebrities, influencers, and politicians often appear in many people's networks. Their presence makes them seem more connected than they are. A person who follows 100 people will still see the same few names appearing repeatedly. This creates the illusion that some people dominate social circles. This paradox has implications for mental health. Social comparison is common, and many people feel their social lives are not as full as others. This is partly due to the friendship paradox. People who feel isolated may be unaware that others experience the same illusion. Understanding this paradox can help people see their networks more clearly. It also affects information flow. If news spreads through a network, the most connected people hear it first. If someone believes that most people are talking about something, it may be because the most social individuals are discussing it. This can distort public perception. People may think an opinion is widespread when it is mostly held by a few highly connected individuals. The paradox appears in economics as well. Wealth and resources often follow a similar pattern. Some people have far more connections to money and opportunities than others. If someone feels that others have better financial networks, this could be due to the same effect. Those with the most resources are more visible. The friendship paradox even affects health. In disease outbreaks, the most connected individuals are at greater risk. If a virus spreads, it reaches social hubs first. This means that people in the network see more cases than average. This effect helps researchers track diseases. By monitoring highly connected individuals, they can detect outbreaks early. In large cities, this paradox can be seen in daily life. Some neighborhoods are more social hubs than others. People in those areas are more likely to meet others with large networks. If someone moves to a new city and feels like others are more socially connected, it may be due to this pattern. It also affects sports and entertainment. Athletes, musicians, and actors often seem more connected than they are. Because they appear in many people's social circles, they give the impression of greater popularity. A local musician may feel that others are more well-known, but this could be an illusion created by the paradox. This pattern is also visible in online communities. Forums, group chats, and message boards all follow the same structure. Some users post frequently and are seen by more members. A person who posts rarely may feel that others are more engaged, but this is due to the way networks distribute attention. In political movements, the paradox plays a role as well. Activists and organizers who know many people seem to have larger movements than they do. If someone believes that a cause is more widespread than it is, it could be because the most vocal members are also the most connected. Education networks follow the same principle. Some students form study groups and interact with many classmates. Others study alone. If a student feels that everyone else is better connected, it may be due to the paradox. Those with the most friends appear in more networks. The paradox can also be applied to hobbies and interests. If someone joins a new hobby and sees others with large social circles, they may assume they are less involved. But in reality, the most engaged members are simply more visible. Even in small groups, this paradox applies. In a close-knit friend group, 1 or 2 people may be the most social. They plan events, introduce new members, and keep connections strong. The other members may feel that they are less connected, but this is an illusion. The most social individuals are simply the ones everyone sees the most. This paradox changes how people think about their social lives. It shows that networks are not evenly distributed. Some people naturally appear in more circles, making it seem like others are more connected. This pattern exists in many areas of life, from friendships to economics to public health. Understanding it helps people see social networks in a clearer way. Imagine walking into a grocery store to buy jam. You approach a display with 24 different flavors. There's strawberry, raspberry, blackberry, blueberry, apricot, mango, and many more. Each jar looks appealing, and the variety feels exciting. But as you stand there, something happens. Instead of feeling happy about having so many options, you feel stuck. You pick up one jar, then another. You try to compare them, but the differences seem small. You wonder if one flavor will be too sweet, if another will have a weird aftertaste, if you will regret your choice. After a few minutes, you put them back and walk away without buying anything. Now imagine a different scenario. You enter a store and see only 6 flavors of jam. The decision is easier. You quickly scan the options, pick one that seems good enough, and move on. You feel satisfied. You made a decision without overthinking. This contrast is the paradox of choice. More options should make things better, but they often make them worse. Choice overload happens in everyday life. Shopping for clothes, picking a restaurant, choosing a movie to watch, these should be simple tasks, but they can become stressful when too many options exist. A clothing store with 10 styles of jeans makes it harder to choose than a store with only 2 or 3. A streaming service with thousands of movies can leave you scrolling for an hour instead of watching something. A restaurant with a massive menu can make you second-guess your order before the waiter even walks away. People assume that more choices lead to better outcomes. This makes sense in theory. If you have more options, you should have a greater chance of finding the best one. But in practice, the opposite often happens. More choices create hesitation, doubt, and even regret. When you pick one thing, you wonder if another might have been better. The fear of making the wrong choice can be worse than the choice itself. Psychologists have studied this effect. In one experiment, researchers set up a table in a grocery store and offered free samples of jam. Sometimes they displayed 6 flavors, and other times they displayed 24. More people stopped when there were 24 options, but fewer people actually bought jam. When there were only 6 options, more people made a purchase. The experiment showed that more choices attract attention, but lead to fewer decisions. There are several reasons for this. One is decision paralysis. When faced with too many options, the brain struggles to compare them. Each option has pros and cons, and the more options exist, the harder it is to weigh them all. Instead of picking something, people often walk away without choosing at all. Another reason is opportunity cost. Every choice means giving up other possibilities. When choosing between 2 pairs of shoes, it's easy to compare them. When choosing between 20, every decision feels like a trade-off. No matter what you choose, you feel like you might be missing out on something better. This can lead to regret, even after the decision is made. Marketing plays a role in this problem. Companies flood consumers with choices, believing that more options will lead to more sales. Supermarkets stock shelves with dozens of variations of the same product. Tech companies release multiple versions of the same device with minor differences. Streaming platforms boast massive libraries of content. While these choices seem like a benefit, they often overwhelm people instead. Dating apps are an extreme example of this paradox. In the past, people met partners through friends, family, or local communities. Choices were limited, but relationships formed naturally. Today, apps provide an endless stream of potential matches. This should make dating easier, but many people find the opposite to be true. With so many choices, commitment becomes harder. People swipe past good options, believing something better is just around the corner. The abundance of choice creates dissatisfaction and indecision. The paradox of choice affects bigger life decisions as well. Career paths have expanded, offering more jobs than ever before. College students struggle to pick a major because the number of possibilities feels overwhelming. Workers second-guess career moves, wondering if they should switch industries or go back to school. More choices create more doubt. Buying a home can also be stressful for this reason. A buyer sees dozens of listings, each with different features, locations, and prices. The process drags on because every option has trade-offs. No house is perfect, and the buyer worries about making the wrong decision. A smaller set of options would make it easier to choose, but the modern real estate market presents a seemingly infinite number of possibilities. Social media amplifies the problem. People constantly see what others are doing, buying, or experiencing. Someone scrolling through vacation photos wonders if they should have picked a different travel destination. Someone seeing posts about a new restaurant questions whether they made the right choice for dinner. Comparison adds another layer of doubt, making decisions feel even less satisfying. Choice overload can also impact mental health. Too many options create stress, anxiety, and dissatisfaction. People who feel overwhelmed by choices may avoid making decisions altogether. This can lead to procrastination, missed opportunities, and frustration. In some cases, it can even contribute to depression, as individuals feel stuck in a loop of indecision. Some people try to counteract this by simplifying their lives. A well-known example is Steve Jobs, who wore the same outfit every day. Mark Zuckerberg does the same. By eliminating small decisions, they saved mental energy for bigger ones. Many successful people follow similar routines to avoid decision fatigue. Minimalism has gained popularity for similar reasons. People who embrace minimalism reduce their belongings and simplify their choices. Fewer clothes mean easier wardrobe decisions. Fewer possessions mean fewer things to worry about. This approach reduces stress and makes daily life more manageable. In some cases, restrictions can improve satisfaction. When people limit their choices, they often feel happier with their decisions. A traveler who picks one destination and commits to it enjoys the experience more than someone who keeps wondering if they should have gone elsewhere. A shopper who walks into a store knowing they will buy only one shirt feels better than someone browsing endlessly without direction. Another solution is setting personal rules for decision-making. Someone who struggles with restaurant choices might decide in advance to always order the first dish that looks good. Someone who spends too much time picking movies might limit themselves to one genre. These self-imposed limits reduce choice overload and make decisions easier. People also find relief by focusing on good enough choices rather than perfect ones. In psychology, this is called satisficing. A person who looks for a meal that is good enough will be happier than someone searching for the absolute best option. A job seeker who picks a job that meets their needs instead of hunting for a perfect fit will feel more satisfied in the long run. Seeking perfection leads to frustration because no option will ever be flawless. This paradox applies to everyday habits as well. People who spend hours comparing reviews before making a purchase often feel less satisfied than those who make quick decisions. The more time spent analyzing, the more room for doubt. Sometimes, making a decision quickly and moving forward leads to greater happiness than searching for the best possible outcome. The paradox of choice challenges the idea that more options lead to better decisions. While having some choice is beneficial, too much creates stress and indecision. The modern world presents endless choices in nearly every aspect of life, from shopping to careers to relationships. People struggle with decision paralysis, regret, and dissatisfaction as a result. The key to avoiding these problems is not to seek more options, but to set limits, embrace simplicity, and accept that no choice will ever be perfect. The Stockdale Paradox comes from the experiences of James Stockdale, a U.S. Navy officer who was held as a prisoner of war in Vietnam for over 7 years. He endured brutal treatment, isolation, and uncertainty. When asked how he survived, he said that it wasn't the optimists who made it through, but rather those who balanced hope with realism. The optimists kept believing they would be rescued by Christmas. When Christmas passed, they moved their expectations to Easter, then Thanksgiving, then another Christmas. Each time their hopes were crushed, and many of them eventually lost the will to survive. Stockdale did not pretend things were better than they were. He accepted the brutal reality of his situation while maintaining a belief that he would eventually prevail. He never set artificial deadlines for rescue, and he did not allow himself to be broken by disappointment. This balance of realism and hope became known as the Stockdale Paradox. It is the idea that to survive difficult situations, a person must confront the harsh facts of their reality while still holding on to the belief that they will ultimately succeed. Imagine two people facing a long, grueling challenge. One is an optimist who believes everything will turn around soon. The other accepts the difficulty, but refuses to give up. The optimist constantly looks for signs that relief is just around the corner. They convince themselves that things will improve in a matter of days or weeks. When that does not happen, they feel defeated. With each new disappointment, their hope weakens. Eventually, they become exhausted and give in to despair. The second person sees the same reality, but does not depend on false hope. They acknowledge that things are hard and will likely remain so for a long time. Instead of waiting for a sudden change, they focus on small daily actions that keep them moving forward. They find meaning in endurance rather than in quick relief. This mindset allows them to persist when others lose their will. This paradox applies to many areas of life. People facing illness, financial hardship, or difficult careers often fall into the trap of false hope. A person with a serious health condition might convince themselves they will be cured in a short time. If treatment takes longer than expected, they become discouraged. Someone struggling in their career might tell themselves that a promotion is just around the corner. When it does not come, they feel like they have failed. The pattern repeats, leading to burnout and disappointment. A person who follows the Stockdale approach would see these situations differently. They would acknowledge that recovery, success, or improvement might take a long time. They would avoid setting specific deadlines for when things must get better. Instead, they would focus on what they can control each day. They would keep going, not because they expect an immediate reward, but because they refuse to give up. History is full of examples of people who survived harsh conditions because they embraced this mindset. During the Great Depression, many believed that prosperity would return quickly. When it didn't, some lost hope. Others accepted that the struggle would last and focused on small ways to endure. Prisoners in war camps, survivors of disasters, and people who overcome deep personal loss often share this perspective. They do not deny reality, but they also do not surrender to it. This paradox does not mean that optimism is bad. Believing in a better future is necessary for survival. But blind optimism, the kind that ignores reality, can be dangerous. When a person ties their hope to an outcome that does not happen, they suffer deeply. The Stockdale Paradox suggests a different kind of hope, one that does not depend on specific timelines. It is the belief that, no matter how long or difficult the road, endurance will eventually lead to success. A young entrepreneur might believe their business will succeed within a year. They pour all their energy into it, expecting quick rewards. If the business struggles, they feel crushed. They wonder if they made a mistake. Another entrepreneur might take a different approach. They accept that success could take many years. They prepare for setbacks. When they face challenges, they are not surprised or discouraged. They adjust and keep moving forward. Over time, their persistence pays off. A person training for a marathon does not assume they will wake up one day and suddenly be able to run the full distance. They know the process will be slow. They prepare for pain, fatigue, and doubt. They trust that by taking small steps each day, they will reach their goal. If they expected immediate progress and did not see it, they might quit before they had the chance to improve. The Stockdale Paradox teaches that success comes not from hoping for the best, but from preparing for the worst while still believing in eventual victory. It is a mindset of resilience. Those who survive and thrive in difficult situations do not do so because they ignored reality. They do so because they faced it fully and refused to let it defeat them. The observer's paradox describes a situation where the act of observing something changes the outcome. This happens in many areas, from physics to human behavior. It can be as simple as people acting differently when they know they are being watched, or as complex as quantum particles behaving one way when measured and another way when left alone. Imagine a workplace where employees know they are being monitored. If cameras record their actions, they might follow all company rules, work harder, and avoid distractions. The moment the cameras are off, they relax and behave differently. The observation itself changes their behavior. The same happens in schools when students know a teacher is watching. Their attention improves, they participate more, and they follow instructions more carefully. This change does not come from a personal decision, but from the presence of an observer. In psychology, this is called the Hawthorne effect. Researchers studying factory workers in the 1920s found that productivity increased when workers knew they were being studied. The original experiment tested lighting conditions, but no matter how the lighting changed, productivity went up as long as the workers felt observed. The moment the study ended, their work habits returned to normal. This effect appears in many studies involving human behavior. When people know they are part of an experiment, they often behave differently than they would in their daily lives. The same paradox appears in language studies. A linguist who wants to record how people speak naturally might struggle because subjects become self-conscious when being recorded. They might adjust their speech, avoid slang, or speak more carefully than they would in casual conversation. The observation changes the very thing being studied. This paradox is not limited to human behavior. It plays a role in physics, particularly in quantum mechanics. The double-slit experiment is one of the most famous examples. When scientists shine light through two narrow slits onto a screen, the light creates an interference pattern, behaving like a wave. However, when they place a measuring device at the slits to observe which slit each photon passes through, the interference pattern disappears. The photons behave like particles instead of waves. The mere act of measurement changes the outcome. This raises fundamental questions about reality. Does observation create reality? If a quantum particle exists in multiple states before being observed, what does that say about the nature of existence? Physicists debate whether particles have definite properties before being measured, or if measurement itself determines their state. In artificial intelligence, the observer's paradox can affect data collection. If users know they are being monitored online, they might change their behavior. They might avoid searching for sensitive topics or alter how they interact with social media. This means data collected from observed behavior might not accurately reflect how people act when they believe they have privacy. The paradox also appears in law enforcement. Police officers patrolling an area may prevent crime simply by being present. Criminals who see an officer nearby may choose not to act. But if police leave, crime rates may return to normal. The act of watching changes what happens. This effect can complicate crime studies. A city might install surveillance cameras and notice a drop in crime, but the cameras themselves may be the reason. If cameras were removed, crime could rise again. The same problem appears in medical research. If patients know they are part of a study, their symptoms might improve, even if they receive a placebo. This is part of the placebo effect, where belief in treatment causes real changes. If a doctor observes patients closely, they might report fewer symptoms because they feel like they are supposed to improve. This can make it difficult to measure the true effect of a drug. In sports, the observer's paradox appears in competition. Athletes often perform differently in practice than in actual games. A basketball player who makes every shot in an empty gym might miss under the pressure of a crowd. A golfer might struggle to sink a putt when dozens of people are watching. The presence of an audience changes their performance, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. The paradox also influences social behavior. In everyday conversations, people act one way in private and another in public. Someone might sing confidently when alone, but hesitate when others are around. A person speaking in a casual setting might become formal and stiff when giving a speech. The awareness of being watched shifts behavior. Journalism experiences this paradox when reporters interview people. A person telling a personal story may change details, whether to appear in a better light or because they feel pressured. If a camera crew is present, they might act less naturally. Reality TV and documentary filmmakers face this challenge. When people know they are on camera, they often act differently than they would in real life. Even in everyday interactions, the observer's paradox can appear in subtle ways. When people know they are being judged, they adjust their actions. In a job interview, candidates might speak more formally than usual. On a first date, someone might behave more politely than they normally would. Social norms influence behavior, but direct observation heightens the effect. Online interactions also show signs of this paradox. People may edit their social media presence to reflect only their best moments. They act differently in online discussions when they know their words are being recorded. Someone who might share an honest opinion in private might hesitate if they know their comment could be screenshotted and shared widely. Even animals display this behavior. In nature documentaries, some animals behave differently when they notice a camera crew. A predator might hesitate to hunt if unfamiliar humans are nearby. Zoo animals act one way when visitors watch and another when they believe they are alone. The presence of an observer can change natural behavior. The paradox raises deep questions about the nature of reality and perception. If people always act differently when watched, can we ever truly study natural behavior? If measuring something changes its state, how can we be sure of objective reality? The observer's paradox does not just exist in science or psychology. It appears everywhere, shaping the way we interact with the world.